The main character dreamed about that guy again, but she was just standing there watching, so she couldn't do jack. Waking up, she wondered if her powers were just gone, 'cause she hadn't used them in forever. Just then, some young dude shouts how awesome it is that Sharn's awake, 'cause the Imperial Court just sent an invite. As Sharn walked down the Emperor's castle hallway, she wondered how long it had been since a slave set foot in this place. About 10 years ago, her homeland, Sursen Island, got conquered, and 3 years later, she and Pachan got caught and sold into slavery. Once all the servants and slaves were in the inner palace, the head housekeeper, Catherine, announced she'd gathered them there for a reason. She explained the Emperor was coming back real soon, so the palace desperately needed advisors, attendants, and maids. The crowd started grumbling, 'cause the rumor was serving that nutjob Emperor was like going nuts yourself. Sharn pointed out it was the first time the servants and slaves were all together, and Pachan figured it meant the war was almost over. Sadly, the castle staff didn't exactly respect or admire the Emperor. They steered clear of him 'cause they were scared stiff. His Majesty Yulian started a war, and now they're saying he's killing servants and livestock every day. The monarch's been married twice, but both wives died violently. Rumor has it the Emperor himself had a hand in it. Catherine asked if there were any volunteers, adding that proactive slaves and servants would get special perks. The woman pointed out that working in the palace is pretty prestigious, so it'll pay a hefty 100 kron. But nobody dared to volunteer for palace service because they knew 100 kron was a pittance for dying. The housekeeper said that if nobody volunteers to serve in the castle, people will be chosen randomly from the crowd. Pachan grumbled that she should have just said that from the start, instead of wasting time yapping, and Sharn suddenly remembered her dreams. Maybe the mention of His Majesty made her remember the man who appears to her in her nightly dreams. Pachan asked the sad Sharn what was wrong, and she asked if he knew why such terrible rumors were going around about the Emperor. The girl pointed out that His Majesty spent many years at war, and usually people like that are respected in society and called heroes. So this dude figured Emperor Yulian got labeled a psycho killer because of some witch's curse. When the girl asked him what he was talking about, he explained that some lady got burned at the stake 25 years back. The story goes that this regular woman became a badass knight, defending Baldek like a hero in a long, drawn-out war. She seemed to have earned the Empire's trust and respect, but once the war wrapped up, some nasty rumors made His Majesty do something awful. Emperor Yulian demanded that the woman, who risked her life to save the country, pay a steep price. Word on the street in the Empire was that this brave woman was a witch, and they ended up tying her to a post. The same voices that used to shout out thanks for saving them were now screaming to light the fire and kill that devil's spawn ASAP. Turns out the people showing her trust and appreciation, praising her like a hero, were just straight up lying. That's when the woman realized she'd gotten in the Empire's way somehow, so they decided to unfairly take her out. She got so pissed that she called His Majesty a piece of trash, good for nothing on this earth. Wrongfully convicted, she cried out, asking if being burned alive at the stake was a fair price for her loyalty to the country. She screamed that her only sins were serving this empire and her knightly oath of fealty. Tied to the stake, the woman asked Yulian what he had done as ruler, if he had simply fled the empire and abandoned his people. Then he got agitated and demanded that they immediately stoke the fire higher and shut that witch up for good. The crowd roared with outrage. How dare that vile witch insult their great emperor? The woman yelled that if she was a witch, then she cursed this pathetic ruler. Yulian exclaimed gleefully, for the crowd to notice that she herself had confessed to being a witch. The woman, engulfed in flames, said with her last strength that from now on, the emperor would suffer a fate worse than death, until he was nothing but bones. She added that now there would be no one left in the empire loyal to him, and his heirs would starve like slaves. She turned to the crowd, urging them to understand that they blindly believed the nonsense spoken by the ruler and didn't suspect they were being treated like dirt. The woman said the words of commoners, the stones they throw, the fire they lit, aren't worth a damn and won't change anything. The crowd started demanding they stoke the fire higher and threw stones even harder, wanting to shut that witch up for good. In her final moments, the woman thought about how much she regretted believing things would get better. She decided that after death, she wanted to become the wind, so she wouldn't depend on anyone and could live for herself. Pachan concluded that nobody wants to be associated with the imperial family anymore because all the witch's words came true. The girl decided she needed to be more careful from now on because the empire executes anyone with magic, all because of that curse. The girl said she was going home to change. Then Pachan asked her to grab his clothes too. Sharn knew perfectly well it was dangerous working for the cursed emperor, but on the other hand, they paid 100 kran a week for it. She imagined that thanks to this, she could save up enough to buy her freedom from slavery and pay off her parents' debts. The girl was secretly happy that she'd finally be able to call herself a free woman and not depend on anyone. The sharp smell of blood suddenly hit Sharn's nose, and before she could even blink, someone pressed a cold sword to her neck. Just then, one of the maids told Catherine that His Majesty had arrived and said he was heading to the training grounds alone. She protested, saying it was impossible because it was promised that the emperor wouldn't arrive for another 3 days. But nonetheless, the man in blood-splattered armor pressed his weapon to the slave girl's throat and asked who she was and what she was doing there. The girl's eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and she could make out the corpse of a horse behind the sword-wielding man. At that moment, Sharn realized that standing before her was none other than the murderous emperor himself. The man insisted she confess what she was doing there, but the girl was terrified by the dark aura radiating from the threat. She blurted out that she'd ended up there completely by accident. The man smiled and replied, "That's what they all say." Then the slave girl decided to run, because she was sure she was about to be brutally cut down. Reaching a rake, the girl grabbed it and shouted that if the man took even one more step towards her, she'd slice him open. Sharn was wondering how much closer he'd get, and how to ditch this creep. The guy was thinking, what a small, pathetic creature she was, especially since she's just a slave. Sharn called the man a psycho and asked why he killed the horse, since it was an imperial steed. He replied that he gave the animal a glorious death, and she wondered if this killer thought she was a complete idiot. She couldn't figure out what he was playing at. Did he really expect her to buy that the animal asked for it? Sharn's patience snapped because she finally realized this crazy dude was talking total nonsense. She swung the rake to scare him off, but the guy reacted fast and grabbed the end of it. He lifted her with one hand and said the steed ate poisonous berries during the fight, and an imperial horse deserves an honorable end. The girl was in shock and couldn't believe she was facing an imperial knight, and just then, Pachan's voice rang out. The guy ran to the scene and hugged Sharn, noticing the empire's crest on the blood-stained armor of the man standing nearby. When Pachan whispered in terror that it was an imperial knight, the girl realized she was toast for threatening him with a rake. The killer kept coming, and she knew she wasn't ready to kick the bucket. Not here, not now. Sharn decided to bolt. For a distraction, she scooped up a handful of dirt and chucked it right in the guy's face. The kids managed to escape, and Pachan wondered if they'd done the right thing, since it was an imperial knight. Sharn was amazed Pachan could ID the Empire's emblem on the attacker's armor so fast, in the dark, and through all that blood. The girl felt awkward because at first she thought he was just some evil spirit, so she attacked him with a rake. Sharn asked if they could pretend it never happened. Pachan guessed, what if it wasn't a knight, but the emperor himself? He's blonde too, right? The girl scoffed, saying that was total garbage because everyone knows His Highness isn't due back at the palace for 3 days. Moments later, the word came down that the honor guard had finally arrived, and leading it was the emperor himself. Sharn saw that at the head of the column was the same blonde dude who'd attacked her and was covered in horse blood. The guy spotted a girl in the crowd and smirked, while Sharn couldn't believe what was happening. But that same night, she found herself tied up in front of the very man she'd been throwing dirt at. The guy called her a rat and said he'd caught her to finally find out who she was and what she was up to. Later, disguised as a palace maid, the girl would wheel a cart of food through the entire imperial palace. As she went, she overheard servants talking, wondering why Emperor Julian had suddenly decided to return. Some thought His Majesty sensed danger because the Chancellor had been ruling for years after his father's death. They claimed bloody winds were coming to the Empire soon, but Sharn decided to ignore the rumors since they weren't important to her. Entering the stable, Sharn called out to Pachan, saying she'd brought him food because she'd been helping the palace servants today. But the room was empty, and Pachan's bed was made. The girl was surprised because the work had been finished a long time ago. A stern male voice asked who she was and who hired her. Sharn had no idea what he was talking about. He figured Chancellor Albert put her up to spying on him, but she denied everything. She hit the ruler with a question. How could someone of his status even bother with a slave? His Majesty ignored that and asked, dripping with sarcasm, if that's why the slave tried to take a swing at him and bolted from the fight. The guy added that everyone knows Albert's got eyes and ears all over the palace, even among the slaves. She blurted out that she had no clue he was the emperor, especially since he offed his horse so casually. The guy pressed, asking if she thought he was a murderer. Sharn stammered that she's just a slave and the emperor shouldn't even listen to her. She added that she was out of line and just misunderstood, and that His Majesty gave his steed a noble end. The guy muttered that she's not the only one Albert's bought off. Sounds just like the Chancellor, always looking for an angle. The emperor revealed that his warhorse was highly trained and served for years, but the second he got to the palace, he chowed down on some poisonous berries. The young ruler concluded that it was a weird coincidence and that the Prime Minister is clearly trying to take him out. The emperor said the slave tells pretty lies, but he's curious if her story lines up with the guy who worked with her that night. He gave the order to his aide, and then they led Pachan past the tied-up Sharn and the emperor. The guy just managed to shout Sharn's name happily before they dragged him into some room. The girl was horrified because she heard a lion's roar, and His Majesty said it was up to the guy whether he lived or became Lion Chow. Sharn was totally confused. Did Emperor Yulian think she was a dude? The girl figured the emperor thought that because of the manure smell and the men's clothes. Just then, the lion came out of its cage and went straight for Pachan. Luckily, there was a rake nearby, and the guy grabbed it like a weapon. The girl begged the emperor to let the poor guy go because he was innocent, and to punish her instead. His Majesty said with a smile that no one's holding the slave. He's already free, but he needs to prove he's not guilty. The lion kept coming, jumping, and roaring like crazy. Pachan was swinging the rake at the animal, but it was clear his chances of survival were zero. The girl couldn't take it anymore. To stop the unfair fight, she screamed with all her might that she'd prove he was innocent. The emperor reacted instantly and ordered them to stop. The lion immediately calmed down, and Pachan finally caught his breath. His Majesty asked Sharn to begin. She said that she and her brother were just simple slaves. The girl added that for 3 years all they did was feed the horses and clean up their mess. They weren't allowed to leave the estate. She clarified that neither she nor her friend had ever seen the emperor, and asked him to consider how either of them could be spies. Suddenly, Sharn went silent and realized those words weren't enough to prove anything. She had to come up with a solid answer, or her friend would be killed because of her. The girl mentally begged herself to think of something convincing to say to the emperor, when she suddenly remembered the man from her dreams. It dawned on her that the man from her dreams was the emperor, and the feeling of dread after the dream was a premonition of today's incident. She remembered that in the dreams, the man was frightened, trembling with fear like a child, and clutching his sword to himself. The girl asked the emperor if he could let go of his sword when it got dark. She said she could help him fall asleep peacefully. The young ruler scoffed, saying it was all bull because he wasn't afraid of nightfall at all. Sharn said she knew a way to make His Majesty actually look forward to darkness. She promised it would get the emperor's blood pumping and give him a thrill. His aide's eyes bugged out at what the kid was saying. A few hours later, a half-asleep Yulian was already sitting on his bed polishing his sword. Hearing footsteps approaching, he said, "Finally, the guy's here." But he looked up and found a beautiful woman standing before him. She bowed and greeted His Majesty, saying she'd come as promised during the interrogation. Yulian remembered talking with his aide earlier, trying to figure out how the interrogated guy knew about his nighttime issues. He realized he hadn't told anyone about it, and Colin had reported that no slave contact with the opposition had been detected. The aide concluded that there was no more intel from the spies, but he had to admit he didn't think the slaves were actually brothers. Colin added that he initially thought the interrogated guy was just a cocky punk, but it turned out to be a woman. The emperor said it was BS, that someone was spreading rumors to trash his reputation, but Colin argued that wasn't the case. But His Majesty ignored his aide's objections, saying his eyesight was fine and ordering him to get lost. The redhead thought it'd be interesting to see what method the captured slave, who turned out to be a girl, would use to heal His Majesty. When the emperor saw the girl in front of him, the first thing he asked was who she was and what she was doing there. She introduced herself as Sharn, a slave, and explained she'd come to help the emperor fight off the darkness. His Majesty asked her to elaborate, and the girl explained that some Sursan natives, including herself, had a special gift. She said she could see and manipulate magic, and that's why she'd been seeing the emperor in her dreams, wandering in darkness and unable to escape. Sharn said, scared, that she wasn't a witch, to which the emperor replied that he didn't give a damn what she was, as long as she could pull it off. Yulian told her to start putting him under, promising that if it worked, she and her little brother would live. When the slave girl heard about the chance to save Pachana's life and her own, she jumped into action. She just grabbed the first thing she could find, and the emperor was all, "Hey, what are you doing snooping around in my bedroom like that?" Sharn apologized for being so forward, but explained that she thought there might be something fishy in his nightstand. The girl found a little figurine tied up with string and explained that someone was using magic to try and off His Majesty. She added that the death would have been slow and agonizing. Yulian couldn't believe Albert had gotten close enough to his bedroom. Sharn replied that she'd take care of the figurine, and the emperor asked if you could just burn it or something. The girl explained to him that dark magic backfires when someone discovers it. She clarified that if a spell is cast, the effect is usually only on the target, but now the target of the spell has changed. Sharn held the figurine over a burning candle and concluded that the spellcaster was about to get seriously burned. Yulian was seriously impressed by how the girl immediately found the cause of his troubles the second she walked into his bedroom. Sharn mumbled, sounding pretty pleased with herself, that one problem was solved, but it was super late and His Majesty needed to get some sleep. Even in bed, Emperor Yulian kept his sword close, a clear sign he trusted no one. Sharn asked if His Majesty ever played word games, wondering if it was just another trick to fall asleep. The slave girl playfully suggested they try it out. Yulian thought it was pretty reckless of her to risk her life for a joke. Sharn announced she'd start and said the first word, but the emperor didn't respond. The girl asked if she was playing by herself, then Yulian grumbled a word starting with the last letter of hers. They played for a while, and Sharn got worried because all the words the emperor chose were so violent and bloodthirsty. But His Majesty seemed to like the game and even started to crack a small smile. Gradually, the emperor quieted down and didn't answer the slave girl's word. Sharn told him to take his time and think. When His Majesty finally drifted off, Sharn brought her glowing hand close to his face to cast a spell. The girl was sure that after this, the emperor would sleep soundly and have peaceful dreams. Sharn backed away from the sleeping emperor, thinking she was glad everything worked out and went smoothly. She figured she could finally breathe easy. Now she and Pachan definitely wouldn't be fed to the lions, and the guy would be sprung from jail tomorrow. Waking up in the morning, Yulian couldn't believe he'd actually managed to get some shut-eye. He glanced at the sleeping slave girl and remembered hearing a woman's voice reciting something like evening prayers over him in his sleep. His Majesty was blown away that he didn't even have nightmares and decided to go over to the slave girl. His approaching footsteps woke her up, and the emperor happily announced he'd come up with the word he was supposed to say during the game. Sharn was stunned. Then His Majesty announced that for her excellent performance she deserved a reward. The girl's eyes lit up with happiness, and she now thought that there's nothing more important than sleep in human life. She started racking her brain, wondering what to ask for as a reward, her favorite food, or to be freed from slavery. But the emperor had his own idea of a reward. He announced to the slave that from now on she would be on night duty as his personal attendant. Sharn was stoked about the new gig at first, but then she realized she was getting more responsibility than she bargained for. She used it as a get-out-of-jail-free card, but the perks of this new position are definitely sweet, especially considering her situation. Yulian snapped, asking if a slave was seriously thinking about the emperor's offer and stalling on an answer. Sharn swore it was a huge honor to get the appointment and reminded him she was just a humble pagan slave. She wondered if someone like her should really be hanging around His Majesty all the time. Yulian asked what the big deal was about him taking a regular slave on as a handmaiden. The girl replied that the Chancellor wouldn't let it slide and would definitely make a fuss. Yulian blew up and asked if the slave was actually asking the Emperor to get permission from the Chancellor. The girl knew it sounded rude and presumptuous, but if the Chancellor found out someone like her was living and working next to the Emperor, he'd kick her out of the palace in a heartbeat. She explained that since the Chancellor was basically running the empire now, the Emperor didn't have much power, and she needed some kind of guarantee she'd be protected. Yulian agreed and asked what the answer was. Sharn smiled nervously, afraid the Emperor would argue and reject the idea. The girl said that as the Emperor's personal attendant, she'd have to not only stop the spellcasters, but also conduct secret investigations. She reminded him that she was a slave, and slaves have a lot of restrictions. His Majesty asked if she was hinting at her freedom. Sharn knew it was a long shot, but for the first time in her life, the Emperor really needed her. The girl wasn't about to miss her chance to end her life of servitude, and said that someone like her wasn't worthy to be near His Majesty. Emperor Yulian smirked, and the girl immediately felt slighted, wondering if he was laughing at her. Then Yulian stepped toward the girl and said that even though he was the bright sun, a plain slave like her would do just fine. At that moment, Sharn wondered if this was really just a normal conversation, but why did she feel the Emperor's dark aura? Colin rushed into his lord's office and asked how he had slept the previous night. The Emperor joked that his assistant always runs to him like a little puppy, so his visit isn't exactly unexpected. The redhead didn't even get offended, just said dogs have a natural nose for weird stuff. He asked him to consider their long friendship and spill what happened last night and how the slave managed to knock him out. Yulian said he hadn't slept that well in ages. Colin chimed in that his lordship looked refreshed and asked him to elaborate. The Emperor asked how the aide knew the slave was female. The redhead said it was an accident, basically. He explained he figured the slave they were questioning might be hiding something, so he peeked into the bathhouse and saw a woman's silhouette. His Majesty clarified, asking if the aide was saying he saw his slave naked. The guy said the maids were covering up the important bits. Then he wanted to know why his lordship was calling the slave his. The Emperor didn't answer and told Colin to shut his trap. He ordered him to head to the training grounds, check the condition and quality of the weapons and armor, and oversee the training of the war horses. The Emperor smirked and added that he was also tasking him with inspecting the soldiers' bare bodies. Colin exclaimed that was inappropriate. Yulian added that the soldiers' bodies needed to be examined from head to toe to look for any wounds or bruises, problems under the fingernails, or other sensitive areas. The boss said that a superior officer caring about his subordinates was a good thing, but Colin wondered if he'd screwed up. His Majesty protested and explained that he just wants his assistant to be a sensitive and considerate leader. In that moment, the redhead remembered how furious the Emperor got when he heard his slave was seen without her clothes. He finally understood why these orders were suddenly coming down, remembered his master's difficult personality, and decided to beg for forgiveness. At that moment, the maids finished helping Sharn transform and began whispering to each other, admiring the resulting look. Catherine remarked that it turned out pretty good, even if it's a little on the masculine side. One maid whispered to her friend that the dressed-up girl now looked like a foreign noblewoman. Catherine said it was time to go to Emperor Yulian since they couldn't keep him waiting. On the way, she told Sharn that only one person in the world could accurately determine her true nature. She clarified that if the Emperor says a rock is a pearl, it'll become one the next day, just like the slave right now. The woman warned Sharn to be endlessly grateful and not even dare to take her eyes off His Majesty. Catherine knocked on His Majesty's chambers and announced that she had brought a new servant. When Sharn entered the Emperor's room, he complained about what was up with the clothes on the southern island. With a displeased look, the Emperor ordered the girl to come closer and pointed to the paper he was holding. The young man said that these were the shackles of his future servant and held the document to a burning candle. The girl was shocked that the Emperor personally burned this document confirming her enslaved status. He declared that from this moment on, Sharn was no longer a humble slave and had every right to be near him every day. Tears of joy welled up in the girl's eyes. She was eternally grateful to her lord because now she could return to her homeland and work. But Sharn's joy was interrupted when His Majesty handed her another contract. It stated that her service would end when the incurable disease was cured and a new empress was found. "This is insane," she protested. "There's no guarantee this'll even happen. This contract is basically indentured servitude." The emperor calmly told her to stamp the document at the bottom, but Sharn replied that she didn't have her seal with her. His Majesty grabbed his sword and smirked, declaring that her blood would suffice. He grabbed her arm and started pulling her towards him, but Sharn resisted with all her might. The struggle ended with her twisting her ankle and accidentally landing right on the emperor's chest. When Sharn realized she was sprawled across His Majesty, she jumped back like she'd been burned. She started begging for the Lord's forgiveness, but he just glanced at her, flustered, and abruptly turned away. Sharn was surprised by this reaction, since everyone knew the emperor had been married twice, but both wives had died young. The girl looked at His Majesty and thought that right now, he didn't look like some demon on horseback, cutting down everything in his path. She said that if His Majesty really needed a seal, she could just draw something at the bottom of the document. Yulian said nothing was needed and asked her to sit next to him. Sharn blurted out that she'd heard the housekeeper was paying 100 kran a week to anyone who served in the imperial palace. The young man calmly mumbled that he'd pay her 1,000 kran a month as his personal maid. The emperor, hearing the girl's exclamation, asked if that wasn't enough, and Sharn asked where to sign. The emperor said there was no need for a signature. A blood oath would suffice, explaining that in the East, they drink wine mixed with each other's blood. This shows the unwavering loyalty of subjects to their lord, and he, in turn, swears to trust and protect his people. Sharn asked if the emperor was really sure he wanted to make a blood oath with her and pay a large sum of 1,000 kran monthly. The emperor declared that even though she was a former slave, she possessed magic, which forced him to value her fairly and pay her a decent price. Sharn thought that she had previously believed His Majesty was indulging her due to ulterior motives, but he was actually valuing her worth. She concluded in her mind that the emperor coming to her in her dreams was a sign from above. Right then, Yulian deliberately nicked himself with his sword and smeared the contract with his bloody finger. Then he showed the girl another document, insisting it was a guarantee she'd do her job properly. Sharn was horrified when she realized the emperor was holding Pachan's indenture papers. Yulian made it clear that if the maid slacked off or even thought about betraying him, he'd take care of her friend. A month later, Sharn mentally listed her accomplishments, diligently learning etiquette, protecting the emperor's sleep. She wondered why she still couldn't visit Pachan, even though he was so close. The last time Sharn tried to see her brother, the housekeeper gave her a real dressing down. She said the personal maid of His Majesty couldn't leave the main palace without explicit permission, but the girl missed and worried about Pachan so much that she decided to ask the master directly for permission. At their first meeting, the emperor seemed like a regular guy, not the cold-blooded fiend she'd initially thought. When the girl got to His Majesty's chambers, she heard a commotion and decided to barge in without permission. She saw the room was a mess, and the emperor was on the floor clutching his head. Sharn realized he'd been cursed. The emperor writhed in pain, so the girl rushed over to help him. But his hand flung the maid aside, while the rest of the emperor's figure seemed to sink into darkness. The girl begged His Majesty to come to his senses and called out her name, but it was no use. He grabbed the girl by the throat, and she realized it was pointless to ask the emperor to come back to his senses, because he'd completely lost it. Sharn wondered if the rumors about the bloodthirsty emperor were true as he threw the maid to the ground. The girl figured it was all because of that dark band. She decided to try and remove it, but the emperor was way stronger. He kept choking the maid, and she thought that if this kept up, she'd pass out. With her last bit of strength, she raised her hands to her tormentor's face, and suddenly magic light poured from her palms. That did it. Emperor Yulian finally snapped out of it and saw Sharn lying on the floor with bruises on her neck. He ran his hand over her injured skin, saying he must have lost it again and almost offed his own servant. She thought to herself that the emperor looked so vulnerable again, and he apologized for his actions. Sharn found marks on her body like she'd been burned at the stake, then felt a sharp pain in her chest. It felt like her lungs were being torn apart by anger, deep resentment, and the feeling of being betrayed. She couldn't figure out who these feelings even belonged to, or who looked so sad in her dreams every night. Suddenly, Sharn opened her eyes, saw the Emperor's worried face, and realized she'd just seen his dream. She wondered if His Majesty felt that kind of pain every night, and if whoever left that doll could have cast a spell. The Emperor said they'd have to tighten security. Sharn apologized for letting her guard down after getting rid of the doll. His Majesty replied that if it were that easy, the Chancellor wouldn't have left this palace. He remembered Prime Minister Albert begging him to be compliant and take his meds, since he'd lost it again. Sharn touched his neck and asked the Emperor if these incidents were a regular thing, since that's supposedly how the last Empress died. The young man smirked, asking if the maid was scared. She nodded and said she needed to know. The Emperor sighed, annoyed, saying he was tired of repeating that he didn't off his wife. He barely even saw her except at the wedding. A month later, for some reason, everyone started saying the bloodthirsty Emperor brutally murdered his wife and her maid. Sharn wondered if someone powerful, like Chancellor Albert, was trying to strip the Emperor of his power. The young man asked why she hadn't run during the attack. She replied that she was His Majesty's maid and shaman. She reminded him that she swore loyalty and blood, and besides, as a maid, she needed to trust and protect her lord. The Emperor was pretty shocked by those words, since he didn't expect to hear that from a maid who'd only been serving him for a month. Meanwhile, the girl was busy thinking that things couldn't keep going on like this. She figured finding and destroying that cursed doll didn't do jack, 'cause the real perp's still MIA. They're probably messing with the Emperor's head somehow, and likely got rid of his inner circle the same way. Sharn asked the Emperor to hang tight for a few, then started racking her brain on how to fix things after today's mess. She knew the Emperor was basically a walking weapon right now, but breaking the spell was beyond her. Plus, messing with magic on someone else is super risky. Finally, she managed to find the right door, deciding the servant's side room would do just fine. She announced that from now on, she'd be by her lord's side every night, guarding his sleep. She mentioned she could stay in the side room, but the Emperor said there was no need since it was all over. The young man asked to be sedated and for her to leave, but Sharn argued that it was only a temporary fix and wouldn't protect him. She explained that since the incident happened because of witchcraft, they needed to fight fire with fire. His Majesty was surprised how the servant still cared about protecting the Emperor after he tried to, deal with her so roughly. Sharn said she could handle anything, just like today, but Yulian got pissed, saying she was just putting on a brave face. He asked if she'd rush to defend him with a sword in her hand, and Sharn shouted back that she'd do it without a second thought. Emperor Yulian asked rhetorically why a servant was raising her voice at him. Once everyone calmed down, Sharn said in a calm voice that she knew a way that would work. She solemnly announced to the Emperor that they would unite, becoming one in soul, mind, and body. His Majesty didn't get it at all, and confusion was written all over his face, so he decided to ask what it was for. Sharn stammered that uniting would help figure out what this magic was and where it came from, and the Emperor told her to back off. The girl rattled on, saying she didn't mean anything crude, that it wasn't about a man and a woman getting down and dirty. He said she didn't have to be embarrassed or explain herself, but Sharn insisted that the Emperor had totally misunderstood. She asked how a simple girl like her could have those kinds of thoughts about the Emperor, since he wasn't even a man. The Emperor's face darkened, and he asked what that meant. Sharn replied that she was talking about a unique type of protective magic. His Majesty pointed out that wasn't what he was asking about. Then the girl realized he meant her intentions. She said that she actually made a pretty decent suggestion, but Yulian's face twisted into a displeased grimace again. He clicked his tongue in annoyance and reminded the maid how she'd just declared that the Emperor wasn't a man. Sharn asked if that even mattered right now, while thinking about how to avoid saying something she'd later regret. The girl stated that she meant His Majesty wasn't just a man, because he was the son of the great Baldec Empire. She started showering the monarch with compliments, but he just sighed in annoyance, saying the maid had a long tongue. He added that it sounded weird, like she'd happily set up shop in the heart of any commoner, but not the Emperor. The girl replied that she wasn't planning on letting anyone move into her heart anyway, because she has Pachan. Emperor Yulian exclaimed happily that that was great news, and Sharn looked at him surprised. Then she announced she was about to explain the protective magic that would make their bodies and minds one. She said that His Majesty would need to drip his blood onto a silk thread that had never been used before. Before going to sleep, the Emperor would tie this thread to his ankle. Sharn explained that she would do the same, but on her foot. She stated that the effect wouldn't be immediate, but if they did it consistently, sooner or later it would work. The girl clarified that they would have to stay in the same room for this. The side room for a servant in these chambers is empty anyway. For some reason, Yulian didn't like the servant's idea. He asked if he understood correctly that she wanted to shift the target of the curse. The girl happily confirmed this, because if she took the curse upon herself, she could dispel it and heal. But the Emperor objected. He said that maybe he didn't know much about magic, but he thought it would be dangerous for the servant. At that moment, Sharn remembered that depending on the type and intensity of the magic, the body could be destroyed. But His Majesty's curse isn't life-threatening, it's more like a little mind-bending. Besides, His Majesty doesn't have an heir yet. It wouldn't be smart to off a direct descendant of the imperial family. Sharn asked the Emperor to make a fist, then asked if he saw how much safer it was to control that fist like that. She stated that first and foremost, if she's in danger, Emperor Yulian will take care of her, just like today. His Majesty remarked that his personal maid really does have a silver tongue. Then he asked them to consider that they wouldn't be loyal to Sharn until they saw some benefit from her. The girl assured him he had nothing to worry about, when she suddenly realized this was the perfect time to ask a favor. She asked if she could leave the palace for a bit, seeing as she'd been diligently studying etiquette and helping the Emperor fall asleep for a whole month. His Majesty gave permission, but warned her not to tell anyone she used to be a stable hand. The girl thought her co-workers would figure it out anyway, but she didn't say it out loud, agreed, and promised to return soon. Head housekeeper Catherine saw the Emperor's maid hightailing it somewhere, kicking up dust. She decided to head to His Majesty's chambers and let him know that Chancellor Albert is throwing a banquet tomorrow night. She mentioned all the aristocrats from the inner circle would be there, and Princess Stuart will be presented. The Emperor pointed out she took Albert's name and asked if the Prime Minister didn't have another unmarried daughter lying around. Catherine wondered if, even without a kid, he could, make one and use it to his advantage. She informed him that Princess Stuart joined the Duke 3 years ago and received an education fit for an empress. Yulian chuckled, reminding her that the second empress died 3 years ago, and asked if they were already hunting for wife number 3. Catherine replied that it would be odd to give the Empress's position to some other family. His Majesty remarked that there wasn't another option, since they already had 2 high-profile families offering up their daughters. Emperor Yulian declared that now the Prime Minister could easily put his daughter in that spot, since nobody else wants it. The guy added that if it goes down like that, he'll be completely cut off. The housekeeper reminded him that he can't go against the Prime Minister's wishes. He said he was in, and asked Catherine to get Sharn ready for the banquet tomorrow. The young man said he had to play his part and was looking forward to Albert's performance at the banquet. He asked if Catherine had taken care of Sharn's background, and she confirmed she had. All the slaves and servants who knew her before are gone from the palace, but she hasn't left the castle walls in 3 years anyway. She said not many people know about the girl, but it's probably not enough. The Chancellor's probably already figured it out. The Emperor, looking pleased, declared that was enough. Then Catherine casually asked where he'd sent Sharn. The woman pointed out it was time for the Emperor to sleep. He replied that the maid had asked to step outside the palace briefly. Catherine sighed, muttering that the maid went to meet that guy after all. His Majesty asked again, did Sharn really go see a man? Catherine said she'd told her to be careful several times. The woman concluded that Sharn didn't listen and went to see the guy who's now pushing up daisies. Just then, the girl threw open the door, yelling happily that she'd finally made it to Pachan. But the dorm was empty. She thought it was weird. He should definitely be here at this hour. She made a mental note that she hadn't run into any of her old co-workers on the way either. Suddenly, some random dude asked who she was and what she wanted. The girl turned and saw just a regular employee, definitely not a slave. She asked him where everyone else was. The guy said everyone who worked here got sent to the work camp. No one knows what they did to deserve getting shipped off to the mines. He explained that people work in the mines till they drop dead, getting beat down every single day. Sharn couldn't understand why Pachan would be sent there. Then it hit her. All the pagan slaves belonged to His Majesty. She wondered if the emperor really did this to her brother. Then she remembered the master threatening to off a slave. The girl was shaking with terror because she'd been doing her job honestly and hadn't betrayed the emperor. She decided it had to be a misunderstanding. His Majesty couldn't do something like that without giving her a heads up. She figured the emperor was a man of his word. He even seemed worried about her today. Leaving the empty dorm, Sharn decided that as his personal maid, she had to trust her lord, no matter what. A memory popped into her head. Their first meeting, when he thought she was a dude and asked why he was creeping around like a rat. Then she remembered how the emperor sicked a lion on her countrymen and then said whether that guy lived depended on what he said. She wondered what her faith was even based on, since at first she'd just been over the moon. Finally, she was enjoying freedom from slavery and a monthly salary of 1,000 coins. She burst into tears on the floor, hating herself for not worrying about Pachan's safety first, instead of just carelessly enjoying her new position. Sharn and Pachan had been inseparable since childhood, so it seemed like it would always be that way. It was hard to imagine anything happening to him. She blamed herself for what happened, mentally begged Pachan for forgiveness, and tried to figure out what to do now. Suddenly, a man's voice called out her name from behind. Sharn turned around and saw Emperor Yulian. He glared at her and ordered her to get off the floor, saying it was unseemly. The girl looked at the emperor and asked if it was all a lie, if he hadn't killed Pachan, but the answer was unexpected. His Majesty called the maid not only greedy, but also quite insolent, and ordered her to follow him. He led her to the main training ground and informed her that it was located not far from the main palace. Sharn said she knew the place, as she had once cleaned here, and the emperor asked her to look down. The girl saw her countrymen alive and well. His Majesty clarified that these were his gladiators. Yulian added that it didn't matter who they were, because at his first command, they were ready to take care of anyone, by any means necessary. Sharn asked if her countrymen would be raised the same way. The emperor agreed. Then the girl glanced worriedly at the guy again. But there was no need to worry, because Pachan didn't feel oppressed and was communicating on equal terms with the other gladiators training. The girl realized that the work camp was just a ruse. In reality, he had prepared this place for Pachan. Sharn was deeply touched by the Lord's noble act and thanked him from the bottom of her heart. Suddenly, he brushed his hand behind her ear, and Sharn felt uneasy, a shiver running down her spine. The emperor remembered giving the slave girl a chance because he was desperate, just trying to survive in this god-forsaken palace. Then Catherine spoke with His Majesty, promising to keep an eye on the slave girl at night to see if she really would help him. It was all a long shot, but it was working. Once, the housekeeper voiced her concern about the emperor spending every night with the maid. Emperor Yulian laughed and asked if Catherine really thought her lord was so easily swayed by beauty. She said that wasn't it at all. She just didn't want to see anyone break his heart. He remembered Sharn shouting that she was His Majesty's maid and swearing an oath on a kiwi, so she believed he'd protected her. He also recalled the moment the maid, with tears in her eyes, argued that the Lord didn't always have to win. He remembered the maid's favorite saying when she'd yell at him that sleeping at sunset was forbidden. But then Catherine dropped the bomb that this guy was tight with Sharn way before they even got to the palace. Julian had already decided a long time ago that words like crush and love were BS, just a load of smoke and mirrors. He knew it was dumb to fixate on someone who gave their heart to another, even if you own everything else about them. His Majesty said there was no need to thank him. It's just a way to keep his property in line. Sharn thought the master seemed upset about something. He added that she didn't need to thank him for taking care of what was his. The young man clarified that it works both ways, so the servant should know her role. He advised her not to forget what her priority is now, and that anything she wants belongs to him. After Emperor Julian left, the girl wondered if this meant she needed to pay closer attention to the agreement. Longing for her brother, she's neglecting her duties in the emperor's eyes. But doesn't His Majesty understand her feelings? Sharn concluded that a simple servant probably can't understand people of noble blood. So that's what the head maid meant when she said serving the emperor isn't just about actions, but about intentions too. Sharn figured if she wanted to stick around the imperial palace, she couldn't be so obvious about how she really felt. She was busy trying to figure out what to do next, and noticed it was crazy hot and stuffy in the training room. Just then, Pachan came up to her and called her name. She rushed to hug him, chirping about how happy she was to see him. The guy replied that at first he thought the goddess Sursoma had descended to him, but it turned out it was just Sharn. Sharn told him to take a good look at himself because he seemed taller and broader. Pachan blushed, all flustered. The girl looked at him and decided that the gladiator life suited him because she hadn't seen him smile so brightly in ages. The guy asked where she'd been all this time because he was so worried. Sharn announced dramatically that she'd become the emperor's personal attendant, curing his insomnia and running from dark forces. She declared that she was getting paid 1,000 crowns a month for it, and the guy's eyes went wide at that kind of money. Sharn made it clear she'd be done with this gig as soon as she was fully recovered, and the emperor found himself a wife. She asked Pachan to hang in there till then, and he smiled and said he was actually digging this life. He mentioned that His Majesty's lion was apparently well-trained and totally bailed when the master showed up. Pachan confessed he was super skeptical about the job at first, but then became deeply grateful to the emperor. He declared that he'd now try his hardest to live up to His Majesty's trust and become a top-notch gladiator. The girl admired her brother and thought about how fiery his personality was, even though he rarely showed it and acted like everything was cool. Sharn was so happy that things were finally good between her and her brother, since they'd been living in the dumps for 3 years, and now they had hope. The girl wondered if Pachan wasn't worried, since she was around His Majesty every single day. Pachan replied that he trusted her more than himself. He was just afraid that in a moment of passion she might, well, use her magic on someone. Sharn melted at those words and said that no man in the world could believe in her or love her with that same kind of strength. The guy asked if she remembered their promise that they'd get married when they returned to the island, but now they both worked for His Majesty. The girl said it was so that, eventually, she could ask the emperor to let her marry him. Then he stated firmly that he was always on Sharn's side, and the girl replied that she would always support him too. That evening, the girl walked to the emperor's room, thinking that his words, though cold, sounded quite truthful. Sharn understood that before becoming useful, she hadn't shown her best side, but first she needed to realize that she was no longer a slave. The girl decided to remember that from now on, she was a loyal servant and should only worry about her lord's safety. She entered His Majesty's chambers and announced that she had brought the sleep medicine. Yulian looked suspiciously at the contents of the cup and asked if it was really medicine, because it looked like, well, something unpleasant mixed with water. Sharn enjoyed the sight and thought that the emperor was partly right. The concoction really did look disgusting. In her mind, the girl was saying, "This is for the threats, the oppressive atmosphere, for hiding the guy from me, and for touching my hair." The girl smirked, saying the taste might be rough because of all the medicinal herbs in it. She asked if the drink was bitter, and the emperor barely choked down the last sip, saying it was fine. Sharn said she was glad, because they say the nastier the medicine tastes, the better it is for you. She confessed she'd added a few more bitter herbs, and the emperor mentally called the maid a little rascal. Looking pleased, the girl grabbed the ball of yarn she'd borrowed from Catherine and announced she'd start the protection magic today. Sharn tied one end of the yarn to the emperor's wrist and wrapped the other end around her ankle. Then she asked him to lie still because she was about to start working the magic. As the girl started whispering over the yarn, Yulian felt a sudden urge to reach out and grab her. But a second later his hand dropped, he calmed down, smiled serenely, and drifted off to sleep. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Albert Stewart mused that he hadn't looked forward to doing absolutely nothing as much as he was looking forward to tomorrow's banquet. He asked if she got the dress, she said yes, and he told her she better outshine everyone at the party. Albert remembered back during the war when Yulian deserted the battlefield, then came back with an entire army. He wondered if anything had changed since then, whether the emperor would grovel at his feet or become a shut-in. The man said they could definitely get rid of him this time if she didn't mess up. She obediently agreed with her father and bowed. The next day, His Majesty put on his formal attire for the banquet. Colin remarked that his lordship looked stunning, and he told his subordinate to never look at him like that again because it was disgusting. The redhead reminded him that he'd been looking at the emperor with an adoring, tender, and loving gaze since he was a baby. Yulian said that was total crap, and his aide pointed out that he'd changed since that new maid showed up. The guy noted that just recently, his lordship was like a devil out for blood, but now he seems more alive. The guy figured that's what a close relationship with a woman does, since a man's at his best when he's with the opposite sex. Yulian sighed, annoyed. His subordinate clearly didn't get what was going on with Sharn. What they did at night wasn't anything like what Colin imagined. The emperor figured if he told the truth now, his assistant would be laughing about it for years, and he really didn't want to have to deal with him. Yulian hoped his assistant was as good at following orders and, inspecting the soldiers as he was at running his mouth. Colin mentioned he'd heard Lady Stuart would be at the banquet, and he hoped she took after her father. Yulian replied that, yeah, there wasn't much intel on that. He wondered what the spies on Albert's side were even doing. The guy pretended not to hear and started thinking. Maybe the secret plan he'd gotten earlier involved the princess. Colin told his lord that it seemed Albert was trying to downplay his illegitimate daughter's background. The emperor countered that you can't stop rumors no matter how hard you try. Sounds like he adopted the girl just to use her. Colin asked if the emperor was seriously planning to marry the princess, since she could have a son. He said Albert would put his grandson on the throne and seize power. Yulian wondered if his assistant thought he hadn't figured that out already. The redhead thought to himself that he'd never doubted His Majesty, and was always amazed by his cleverness and battle prowess. Once, after a successful fight against a horde of monsters, Colin asked the Lord how he'd chosen that tactic. He thought it was a genius move to burn everything around them to get rid of the webs, and then to funnel them all in one direction and wipe them out in one go. The emperor replied that he'd learned from the chancellor. At the banquet, the guests whispered about how wonderful everything looked. You could tell the prime minister had put in the effort. Someone said this banquet was in honor of the emperor, who'd been on the battlefield. Someone else countered that he hadn't had it that bad out there. No one knows if he's recovered after seeing that monster. Someone asked, "Wonder if he'll totally lose it tonight." Someone else chimed in, "Be careful, I heard one lady's got a scar on her face after an encounter with the emperor." Someone declared, "I wish the previous emperor had had another kid." Suddenly, a voice rang out in the hall, commanding everyone to be silent, for His Majesty Yulian Baldek had arrived. Seeing the knights escorting the emperor, the guests started whispering, could these strong guards really be the so-called rabble everyone's talking about? Again, the question arose. Wasn't the emperor supposed to be an awkward, out-of-breath young guy, basically a useless pretty face? Everyone was wondering, who is this confident young man with the squared shoulders and swagger? They saw a completely different person in Emperor Yulian and couldn't understand what had happened to him in 3 years. A gray-haired man walked across the hall, approached the emperor, knelt, and greeted him. He announced to His Majesty that his humble servant, the Prime Minister, had arrived. Sharn looked at her reflection, wondering if this wasn't a bit too revealing and extravagant an outfit for a regular maid. The head maid told the girl to hurry up and follow her. After all, she had to pretend to be the emperor's woman at the banquet. Sharn asked for clarification. Wasn't she going to the banquet to serve His Majesty? Catherine explained that at the banquet, the maid would have to play the part of the emperor's beloved. She added that they had to contain the forces threatening His Majesty's rule. Sharn asked if the head maid really wanted a servant girl fighting the nobles right now. She pointed out she'd only arrived at the palace a month ago, but Catherine reassured her there was nothing to worry about, since she only had one job. The woman said the emperor was being falsely accused of murdering his wives, and the nobles think he hates women. They think he's got issues with his mother abandoning him, and that he only got power because of his blood relation to the emperor. The nobles believe a crazy emperor who flips out at the sight of a woman isn't fit to rule. Everyone thinks Albert cares about the crazy emperor, but he's actually been messing with his head the whole time. Nobody knows that, though, and if his daughter becomes empress, all the power will be in the prime minister's hands. Catherine was afraid the emperor would only be needed until the new empress got pregnant. She said Sharn needed to show everyone the Emperor's okay, that he's not freaking out around women anymore. At the same time, the girl had to show she was special, the one and only in the Emperor's life. Meanwhile, at the banquet, the Emperor was busy with small talk, everyone expressing their joy at his safe return from the war. But now that peacetime's here, it's time to indulge in favorite hobbies, like seasonal deer hunting. Albert answered for Julian, guessing he was already busy preparing the gladiators. The Emperor replied it was just a bit of fun. His warriors were still kids, but the Chancellor's gladiators were world-renowned. His Majesty mentioned rumors were going around that Albert was raising his own army, one that rivaled the imperial forces. Then the Chancellor suggested a friendly match to compare gladiators, since his kids definitely had something to teach the Emperor's little ones. The crowd buzzed, discussing how the Prime Minister was talking to His Majesty like an equal, disrespectful, even cheeky. Some remarked that even fathers and sons don't have such trusting relationships. Since Albert cares so much for the Emperor, he has nothing to worry about. Suddenly, it was announced that Princess Diana Stuart, a lady from Duke Albert's house, had arrived. The sound of heels echoed through the hall. Everyone was on edge. This girl looked just like the last Empress. Colin even thought it was her. Princess Diana was wearing the same kind of dress His Majesty's wife used to love. The Prime Minister's daughter, the future lady of the palace, bowed to the Emperor and greeted him as the son of the Empire. The girl told herself things were going great. She'd greeted the Emperor like her father told her, and the nobles liked her. She happily figured all she had to do now was take the empty seat next to His Majesty. But what happened next shocked her. Instead of taking the princess's hand and greeting her, Julian knocked over a glass, spilling wine all over the chair. He said his hand slipped, it was an accident, and asked them to take the chair away since it was stained. The banquet guests started whispering again. Shouldn't the princess be sitting next to the Emperor as the next Empress? But someone told them to shut up or the Chancellor would hear. The situation was awkward enough already. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister was furious that the little brat couldn't pull it off. Now Julian had given him an opening to move against him. The guy changed the subject, said he'd heard a rumor but didn't believe it, so he wanted to ask the Emperor himself. He said people were saying His Majesty was keeping a slave girl around as a servant. The Emperor asked if that was against the rules, and Albert added that the Empire's son was allowed anything. He pointed out it could hurt the monarch's image, having someone around who used to shovel horse manure. The crowd of nobles started buzzing again, begging the Emperor to reconsider, saying the Empire's reputation couldn't be tarnished. They shouted that a common slave couldn't be near the ruler. Someone said the ruler was definitely off his rocker since he'd already, taken care of all his empresses, but now he's got a slave nearby. Another guy guessed that maybe the Emperor was trying to avoid marrying the Prime Minister's daughter this way. Someone argued back that the Emperor was dumb and young. You could pressure him. If you criticized him, he'd fly off the handle again. Julian asked why everyone suddenly went quiet, nobody giving advice. Did they really think he'd explain himself to them? The nobles fired back, saying that wasn't the case at all, and you could feel the tension thicken in the room. The Chancellor grabbed the princess, yanked her close, and announced that now that the war was over, the Emperor should start thinking about an heir. The guy said he was, as always, giving the Emperor his best, so he shouldn't defile his noble body with that. Julian said he didn't get what Albert was driving at and ordered Colin to read the prepared document. The redhead announced that Lady Stuart would remain in the palace for 100 days while they considered her qualifications to be Empress. The Chancellor was stunned that the Emperor wasn't the docile, obedient kid he used to be, just doing what he was told. He said he'd eagerly await His Majesty's decision, but he was still curious about the situation with the servant girl. Just then, a woman's voice echoed through the banquet hall, greeting His Majesty and announcing that she had arrived. Everyone turned around, outraged, asking who she was and why she was wearing such a scandalous outfit. Some of them realized it was that no-good maid, since only pagan slaves would dare wear something like that. Sharn realized that all her time in the palace hadn't taught her how to face down aristocrats without freaking out. Then she remembered the headmaid's advice, picture them as horses. So the girl did just that, shook off her nerves, walked right up to the Emperor, and threw her arms around him. She chirped sweetly that she hated His Majesty for leaving her all alone. Sharn added that he didn't have to worry about anything now because his darling was here, right by his side. A murmur went through the hall. People were baffled why the Emperor wasn't having a fit after she jumped him like that. Someone remarked that the girl was a real beauty and didn't seem like a simpleton. She was probably nobility from Sursen Island. Besides, the Emperor isn't mad or yelling at her. Either he's completely lost it or this girl's got serious pedigree. Looks like the Prime Minister's in shock, can't even process how screwed he is, and the princess is too scared to even look at her dad. The Chancellor couldn't wrap his head around the fact that a stable slave who was shoveling manure yesterday is now next to the Emperor. The guy was wondering if she was looking down on him too much, considering she used to be trash under the noble's feet. He sensed this mysterious energy around her and figured that's why the curse on the Emperor didn't work. The Prime Minister decided to take her out before she became a real problem and said he was pretty surprised. He remarked that His Majesty managed to pick a good rock out of the stable, polish it up a bit, and turn it into a diamond. Julian thought the Prime Minister wasn't even trying to hide his intentions, acting like he was the Emperor himself. His Majesty asked Albert if he wasn't taught that even stones can become a sword if you sharpen them right. The guy replied that he must have skipped that lesson because he doesn't see how a rock picked up in a manure field turns into a pearl. The Emperor said he never expected Albert to say something like that, since he doesn't even remember which field he sowed his seeds in. He wondered if the Chancellor was suggesting that the Emperor's eye for talent was worse than his own seed. Julian thought to himself that if Albert already saw himself on the throne, he was going to be making a lot more mistakes down the line. Sharn said she was tired and would head out first, but she was really thinking she must be crazy for even sitting on the Emperor's lap. When she left the banquet hall, she breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was finally over and had gone pretty well. She was glad the nobles bought her act, even though her sitting on his lap was totally ridiculous. The Emperor was probably in shock, but how could she act all high and mighty when she's just a personal servant? The girl realized she didn't belong in this charade and needed to focus on her servant duties. She could still hear the Chancellor's harsh words in her head about how you can't make a pearl out of a rock picked up from the dirt. Rumor has it the Prime Minister has a kind face, but at the banquet his gaze was cold, and he seemed ready to stab you in the back at any moment. There were also a lot of aristocrats at the banquet who support the Chancellor. Sharn couldn't imagine having to fight him now. In the hallway, the girl overheard Lady Stuart and a maid talking as they passed by, and she remembered Catherine's words that the marriage would still happen. On one hand, she was sad because the Emperor's power might suffer from this alliance. On the bright side, she was stoked to finally get out of that contract and head back to her island home. The princess didn't seem as nasty as the Chancellor, so Sharn figured Diana should definitely marry His Majesty if she wanted to go home. At the banquet, Lady Stuart seemed bummed, probably because she thought the Emperor was playing the field. Sharn was hoping this wouldn't make the princess call off the wedding. She wanted to explain everything, but couldn't blow the plan. The girl decided to just say hi to the princess and not get into it, since her future husband could explain things way better. When Sharn introduced herself and greeted Lady Stuart, her maid slapped her across the face, telling her to know her place. The girl stared at Lady Stuart's calm expression, unable to believe this peaceful-looking person had ordered her maid to hit her. Sharn figured Lady Stuart was so chill because she had no idea she was walking into a real mess. Sharn said she understood the princess's frustration, and Lady Eaton, the maid, got all huffy, asking how she dared talk back. She wound up for another slap, but the princess stopped her. The maid said this lowlife had the nerve to speak to her ladyship. Sharn was surprised. Was that really enough to warrant a smack? And Her Highness told Lady Eaton not to get worked up, since the poor servant probably didn't know the palace rules. Diana asked if the maid was from Sursen Island, and Sharn confirmed that she was. Then Diana wondered if everyone there was as tacky as the servant, showing up to a banquet barely covered. Sharn replied that the princess just didn't know much about the island, since the climate there is really hot, and the clothes are made of light fabrics. The girl clarified that it really helps the skin of the Sursen Islanders breathe freely. Her Highness said that the way the servant tells it, you'd think everyone there walks around practically naked, like streetwalkers. The girl thought that the mistress's dislike was clear, and obviously the people of the empire don't understand the national dress of Sursum Island. She couldn't understand why someone who's going to be empress of the whole country would talk smack about another country like that. Sharn thought to herself that she felt sorry for the emperor, having to spend his life with someone like that. She addressed the princess as Lady, but Her Highness got indignant, demanding the servant address her as Empress. Sharn pointed out the princess wasn't as simple as she seemed, and she replied that it looked like the maid was giving her too much credit. The girl told her ladyship she looked so composed looking up at her, sitting on the emperor's lap. She added that His Majesty was holding her so tenderly, making sure she didn't fall off his knees, which really ticked Diana off. The princess's anger flared when Sharn said the empire would be eternally grateful to her ladyship for the grace she showed at the banquet. Those words sent the governess into a rage again, and she raised her hand to strike Sharn, but then a woman's voice echoed in the hallway. The headmaid demanded to know what all the commotion was about, with a couple of guards standing right behind her. She ordered them to grab the redhead causing a ruckus, but Lady Diana protested that she was her personal maid. That didn't stop the knights, so her ladyship commanded them to take their hands off the maid by order of the empress. Catherine said the princess wasn't empress yet, just a guest in the hall, and it was way too early to be throwing her weight around. Lady Diana reminded her she was the prime minister's daughter and would soon be empress, and the head maid should fear the consequences. Catherine pointed out that she knew Lady Diana had received the empress's education, but it seemed the chancellor had overestimated the daughter. She tossed out that there hadn't been enough time for her to fully grasp the basics of imperial etiquette, and approached Sharn. She stated that physically harming His Majesty's personal maid was equivalent to treason. Catherine clarified that for such an act, the maid should be hanged. Then she approached Sharn and asked if she was badly hurt. Sharn was in shock, but replied that she seemed to have bitten her cheek. Her mouth was bloody now, and her gums still ached. Sharn added that she thought her tooth ached. Then the princess's and Lady Eaton's eyes grew even wider with fright and fear. Catherine declared that this was a serious offense. Then the red-haired girl cried, begging her mistress to do something. But Princess Diana couldn't do anything about it, and just stood there silently. Catherine ordered the red-haired girl to be held under arrest until the emperor personally decided on the punishment. Heading to the emperor's chambers, Sharn wondered if that girl would really be executed. Catherine told me not to worry, but Sharn was definitely anxious. Sure, she was mad, but she didn't think a slap was worth that. Sharn finally understood how important being a personal maid was. Back when she was a slave, they just whipped her. When she got the okay to enter, she threw open the emperor's chamber door and froze, totally stunned. The emperor was unbuttoning his jacket and shirt because he wanted to change. He told the maid to wait a sec. She offered to help him, but he turned her down. It wasn't awkward at all, 'cause Sharn and His Majesty were both used to seeing some skin. The emperor asked how she'd managed to hurt her cheek, and in that instant, a wave of anger crashed over Sharn. 'Cause she remembered what happened earlier, when they told her she was just a slave who used to shovel horse crap. So she came up with an answer for the emperor. She said she was rushing to see him and tripped and fell. She figured His Majesty was an aristocrat too. He'd probably take the same side as that lady. The last thing she needed was some drama delaying the imperial wedding. But those words stung the girl, being the emperor's servant and all. She asked His Highness what he thought about Lady Stuart. His Majesty said it was a dumb question since it's just a political marriage, and his feelings don't factor into it. Sharn asked if the emperor wouldn't be happier if his wife turned out to be a good person. Plus, it would probably do wonders for his insomnia. Sharn admitted that maybe, just maybe, she could finally leave this job with a clear conscience and get out of here. The emperor gave the servant a hard look and asked what she was talking about. Sharn replied that she didn't mean anything by it, because she's sure the lady doesn't know she's a stand-in girlfriend. She added that today she became convinced that the future empress isn't the type to just sit around and do nothing. But she's worried that if the lady gets the wrong idea now, there'll be problems after she marries the emperor. The emperor asked what the servant planned to do about it, and Sharn replied that they could talk to the princess and explain everything. The dude smirked and asked why he needed to explain anything, seeing as he's single. Sharn said she just wanted the master to be happy. Then the emperor grabbed the maid by the throat. and asked if she wasn't now obligated to serve him for life with intentions like that. He asked sternly why the maid was telling His Majesty she was loyal and only cared about him, while also trying to run off with that slave. The girl's eyes widened even more in shock, and then she apologized to the master for being overly presumptuous. The emperor suddenly got flustered, backed away from Sharn, and said she wouldn't be doing any magic tonight. The girl protested and asked why, but His Majesty insisted. Sharn looked at the bottle sitting on the master's bedside table and remembered their argument about it the other day. Once Sharn picked up the bottle and, because of the distinct smell, asked the emperor if it was strong liquor. He said it was, and the maid said he shouldn't drink it because it might mess with his medicine. She was surprised the master even drank that stuff. I mean, the bottle didn't even have a label. The emperor explained he started drinking it back when he started fighting monsters, said he needed something to knock him out on the battlefield after a fight. Then the maid's face lit up, and she declared that the master wouldn't have to drink that anymore. And that bottle's still in the emperor's bedroom, and our girl's kicking herself for saying too much. Maybe for the master, this marriage is just a tool to grab power, but Sharn was daydreaming and said a marriage should be happy. She cursed herself for speaking her mind. It's a political marriage, after all, happening because of the prime minister. The girl reminded herself to know her place, not cross the line, and remember she could be out of here soon. One day the contract with the emperor will end, and Pachin will have built up his gladiator rep, and together they'll escape to Sursen Island. Suddenly, the daydreaming girl heard strange sounds coming from the master's bedroom. The emperor was dreaming that he'd been wandering alone for days through some desolate wasteland. His Majesty was beat and thirsty when, out of nowhere, a woman's voice boomed from the sky, saying the tyrant's kid was growing in its mother's womb. That line was familiar to him, just like the next one, that his whole bloodline would live as lonely and poor as this scorched earth. Suddenly, the young man stumbled upon a pile of ash. The voice announced that the fire of damnation would always be a part of his life. Just like that witch, all that's left of her is ash. Black, tentacle-like things wrapped around the guy's legs, arms, and neck. He started choking, begging in his mind for it all to stop, because this curse can't just keep going on forever. The next second, the emperor's hands were free, and he was holding a dagger. It flashed through his mind that he could finally end this torment with his own 2 hands. Suddenly, a bright light shined down on the guy from somewhere, and he heard the familiar, gentle voice of his maid, Sharn. She said she'd take all of her lord's suffering and pain onto herself. Just then, the dagger in the young guy's hand vanished, and he reached out for his savior. That's when he noticed a red string tied around his wrist. Waking up, His Majesty went straight to his personal maid, who was sleeping nearby. The emperor was fuming inside, thinking Sharn was sticking her nose even into his dreams. He brushed his hand across her face. Her skin was so smooth it felt like standing in a downpour for a second. And he just couldn't help himself, just standing there getting soaked. It was the dead of night, and the emperor was still sitting next to Sharn. He stared at the bruise on the maid's cheek, wondering who could have hit her, because it was obvious she was lying when she said she tripped and fell. The young man decided to get a report from the head maid, Catherine, first, and then ask Sharn again. Suddenly, the guy noticed the maid was tossing and turning like crazy, kicking her legs. Guess that's just how she sleeps. The blanket was practically falling off, so the emperor fixed it, tucking her in. He muttered quietly, wondering who'd take care of him if his personal maid caught a cold. The young man told himself he only did it as a ruler, looking out for his people. Nothing more. Meanwhile, things were tense back at Duke Stuart's mansion. The father was yelling at his daughter because he'd told her 1,000,000 times that Yulian hated his mother. That's why he always picked out those plain, boring outfits for the princess. But the stubborn girl decided to be different and wore a dress just like the late empress. She apologized to her father. Diana tried to justify it, saying that guys who lost their moms young always have this longing for them. She pointed out that she felt the same way when she was 17. The girl mentioned she wanted to help Yulian let out all his pent-up feelings. And by doing that, win him over. Diana said she planned to pull out all the stops to get what she wanted. The man exploded, asking who filled her head with that garbage. The girl shot back that it wasn't garbage at all. She read it in a book. Then her father scoffed, saying she'd believe any old wives' tale. He then added in a serious tone that human emotions aren't as simple as she thinks. You can't just fix someone by letting them vent. Trust can vanish in an instant. Her father told her to stop being so naive and acting like a kid, because reality is nothing like the books. He pointed out that the Empress's story didn't teach her to be careful, because today she acted like a wild woman. The man said his reputation took a hit because of the scene she caused at the Imperial Palace over some guest. She said she was just really upset because His Majesty wasn't paying her any attention back then. Diana added that she would make amends and do things differently if her father gave her control over the Emperor's heart. He countered that if you could just take over someone's mind like that, the whole world would have belonged to sorcerers a long time ago. The girl threw herself at her father's feet and begged him not to abandon her, saying she wouldn't make any more mistakes with the Emperor. She cried, saying she didn't want to go back to those slums, and the man said that in that case his daughter needed to have Yulian's child. Then her father could live as a king regent, but even if Diana doesn't succeed, he won't abandon her. He'll just take care of her. As he left, the man decided it wasn't worth believing his daughter would achieve anything, and that it was better to increase the magic's intensity. However, lately the magic hasn't been working well on the Emperor, probably because that slave girl is near him. The Emperor's assistant, Colin, shouted happily that the banquet operation was a success. Catherine said not to jump to conclusions. The redhead called the headmaid Mom. He countered that the vibe at the event was totally different. You should have seen the looks on those old aristocrats' faces. The Emperor said it was all Sharn's doing. Even the pro-imperial faction didn't dare say a word against it. Colin smugly pointed out that things would be changing from now on, putting an end to the rumors about His Majesty freaking out around women. Catherine remarked that if any other woman had been sitting next to the Emperor, nobody would have bought it. She added that she'd initially had serious doubts about whether the maid could pull it off, but thanks to her beauty and magical abilities, she exceeded all expectations. Out of the blue, His Majesty asked who dared to hit his personal maid. Instead of answering, the head maid announced that she'd already thrown Princess Stuart's maid in the slammer. The Emperor asked which family that maid was from. Catherine replied that she was the heir of Baron Eaton from the western border. He's a real go-getter, wants to be in the thick of central politics, and he busted his butt to get his daughter a maid gig for the future Empress. Colin pointed out the Baron's been working hard for the Chancellor, no matter how you slice it. While Catherine was chewing out her son, the Emperor wondered, wasn't this the Baron they sent troops to help defend the border? Colin confirmed it, adding that these soldiers were Celtic barbarians, fought like wild animals. The Emperor said that explained why the western border hadn't been breached once. Catherine remarked it was no wonder Albont agreed to promote Baron Eaton's daughter. The aide asked if it wouldn't be overkill to go after her just for a slap. Yulian pointed out that because his precious maid got roughed up, she lost 2 teeth. Catherine clarified, weren't her gums torn up and bleeding? Colin chimed in that it was a great story, good enough to kill for. A few days later, heavy pounding echoed through Baron Eaton's estate. The dust was crazy thick, fences and barriers were totally wrecked. The estate owner himself stormed up to the guard, demanding to know what idiot dared shoot at them. The rattled kid told the lord the attacker's flag had a white lion on it, and the Baron was just as stunned. Sure enough, His Majesty was standing right outside the estate walls with his whole army. Meanwhile, back at the Imperial Palace, Colin was asking Sharn if he really had to carry this huge crate all the way. The heroine said yes, and then thanked the guy for volunteering to help out. He pointed out it was the traditional dress of the Sursen Island people, then asked if she wasn't going to wear it anymore. Sharn replied that she was comfortable in her own clothes, but people at the palace saw national costumes differently. The girl added that she didn't want people in the Empire to get the wrong idea about the women of Sursen Island. Besides, the headmaid gave her some clothes that were more familiar and acceptable to the palace crowd. Colin then asked what Sharn was holding. The girl explained the Emperor covered her with this blanket, but he left in the morning. She didn't know what to do with it, so she decided to take it to the headmaid. The redhead said spring had finally arrived for the Lord. Sharn was surprised and asked him to explain. Colin said he hadn't seen His Majesty so kind and affectionate in ages. The girl remembered how poorly the Lord had treated her and said their relationship was complicated, to say the least. She said she had a hard time figuring out which side of the emperor was genuine. The guy happily concluded that Sharn wanted to get to know him better. He declared that he knew the emperor better than anyone, since he's been his childhood friend. So Sharn shouldn't hesitate to ask him anything about the Lord. The heroine wondered how the emperor would react to his personal maid getting close to his childhood friend. Meanwhile, the emperor's army continued to smash through the defenses of the baron's estate. Since ancient times, firing cannons or catapults has been considered a demonstration of His Majesty's will. So he punishes subjects for treason. The baron figured the emperor was on to him, knew he was in cahoots with the prime minister. The guard asked if they should attack the advancing army, and the baron blew up, asking what kind of garbage he was spouting. 3 years ago, nobody would have believed the emperor wasn't just some scared kid afraid of the throne, or that he'd pose any real threat. The baron knew those battlefield wins weren't just dumb luck. The war showed Julian's resourcefulness, his brains, everything. The nobles were sweating bullets, he'd bite it and leave no air. The emperor cemented his place on the throne, building a loyal army from common soldiers, mostly just regular Joes off the street. First, the baron panicked, then he realized the cannon fire was just a warning shot. The guy figured if he stalled any longer, His Majesty would definitely lose it, so he ordered the guard to open the gates pronto. He greeted the Lord and called him the son of the empire. Suddenly, a pitiful woman's scream pierced the air, calling for her father. The baron looked up and saw his little girl, Janice, begging him to save her. He asked the emperor why his daughter was in such a terrible state and locked in a cage. Julian explained that there was an incident at the banquet. Lady Eaton had struck his personal secretary in the face. The guy lost 5 teeth and coughed up blood for days afterwards. The emperor declared that he was very upset by this and came to announce that he intended to punish Lady Eaton. Even though the girl insisted it was just a light slap, the baron was deeply disappointed in his daughter. The man was certain it was his fault, sending his daughter to serve the future empress, only for her to fall into the clutches of a venomous snake. He knew that according to imperial law, his little one could be executed. Especially now that the gates were open, the emperor had arrived with an army, and the baron hadn't even had time to prepare because he knew nothing. The prime minister had to have known that there was an issue involving his daughter's maid. He knew the emperor's plans inside and out, but he didn't warn Lord Eaton, didn't send him a single damn message. Did that son of a really decide to screw over little Janice just to get rid of Baron Eaton? All the guy could do was drop to his knees in front of the monarch, famous for being a real piece of work, and beg for mercy. He pleaded with His Majesty to at least spare his wife and daughter. Julian pointed out that it seemed Baron Eaton knocked up his daughter when he was 40. The emperor added that it made sense why the girl acted so immature. Guess the baron didn't have time to teach her everything. He mentioned he was a merciful ruler, but this was the last time he'd let Baron Eaton off the hook. Then he ordered Lady Eaton to be released and wondered what the man was planning to do now. After a while, Lady Eaton turned to Lady Shara, begging her to forgive her and her family. The main character was shocked to hear that from someone who, just a little while ago, thought she was lower than dirt. "I just heard some rumors about what's been going on in the palace," the redhead said. Spahn thought to herself, looks like the emperor had a real talk with the Eaton family, considering how quickly she bowed her head. But hey, this works for me, Janice thought. She then asked the main character, "So, are you forgiven?" When Sharn said yes, the redhead jumped for joy and just lit up. "Thank you," she gushed. "What a relief!" Then she explained, "The emperor himself demanded that the offender apologize to the victim. Looks like he really cares about his girl." While our girl was busy cringing about how dumb she looked when she lied about her cheek, Lady Eaton said, "I'd love to hear your sweet love story." Suddenly, Janice noticed that Sharn wasn't wearing her people's traditional clothes. "Guess that's because of me and Princess Stuart," she thought. Then, timidly, she offered, I wanted to give you a little piece of advice, Sharn." Before the main character could even react, Janice stepped closer and whispered in her ear, "You need to watch out for Nabi. I bet a ton of viewers are dying to know what Lady Eaton was on about, but the author's keeping us in the dark." Instead, we see Julian back at the palace, giving his maid the serious eye. Sharn started rambling, saying how glad she was he was back safe and sound, and he asked why she changed her clothes. She remembered it was the emperor who insisted she wear her people's traditional garb to the banquet. Our girl said she figured the palace folks were getting a little hot and bothered by how revealing the outfit was. The emperor asked if Sharn herself was uncomfortable in it, and she shyly, hesitantly agreed. Yulian said that in that case, she should just do whatever she feels is best. Then she offered to get him his medicine, since he hadn't been taking it while he was away, and the emperor agreed. Sharn was surprised he agreed so quickly and didn't argue. She couldn't help but be happy about it. Then she remembered Janice saying that the emperor valued her, and her smile got even wider. No wonder Yulian got the hiccups. The personal maid was thinking about him so much. After that conversation, His Majesty was working in his office. Suddenly, he heard the creak of the door opening and voices apologizing for the disturbance. Raising his head, the emperor saw two dark figures before him, radiating a creepy vibe. Yulian exclaimed, startled, demanding to know who these strangers were and who gave them permission to enter. The dark figures said they came with a surprise, but noticing the confusion on their lord's face, they introduced themselves as Catherine and Colin and asked if he recognized them. Colin mentioned that on the battlefield, he'd often heard the emperor longing for Catherine's blueberry pie. Yulian admitted it was absolutely true, and his subordinates began urging their lord to try just a little. The emperor thanked Catherine and agreed. The subordinates watched with smiles as their lord devoured piece after piece. Suddenly, a woman's scream echoed from outside the door, calling Colin's name. She'd smelled poison coming from His Majesty's study. By the time Sharn, Colin, and Catherine burst into the Lord's office, it was already too late. The redhead shouted, "What the heck is going on here? And who are these guys?" Catherine guessed. "They're just some randoms, dressed up exactly like the Emperor's servants." The Emperor's aide asked, "What do we do with them now?" But the Lord remained silent. Sharn asked, "How much did His Majesty manage to eat?" But instead of answering, he just collapsed. Julian heard Sharn's voice, saying she'd been trying for so long, but it was no use. The Lord had eaten too much. She said she'd seen berries like that on her island, looking like blueberries, but incredibly dangerous. "Looks like the poison's already spreading. We need an antidote ASAP, or things are going to get really bad." Colin was pushing to call the Emperor's personal physician, but Catherine pointed out that the criminals had even bribed the guards. She doubted they could find a decent healer anywhere in the palace now. Sharn said she could make the antidote herself. A little later, the main character was already in the herb garden, an hour's ride from the palace. The girl asked the garden's owner if he had an herbaceous plant with yellow flowers. The man said he knew the plant, but the entire harvest had already been sent to the palace. Now you could only find it on those hills over there. These hills were very far away, but there was no other way. Sharn and Colin headed out there. On the way, the heroine said it was all her fault. Because of her reckless actions, the Prime Minister used magic so openly. The guy said he didn't think so. After all, the marriage to the princess hadn't been announced yet. Sharn asked why Albant wasn't being executed for witchcraft. Colin replied that there were two whole reasons for that, namely, evidence and political power. After all, the people who were pretending to be the Emperor's servants are dead, which means the main evidence of the crime is gone. Besides, when Albant was regent for the young emperor, he seriously consolidated his power, both in the palace and beyond. This whole thing might not even lead to an execution, but His Majesty could still face attacks from the aristocracy. That's why the last banquet was so important. The emperor wanted to lay the groundwork for turning the aristocrats into a pro-imperial faction. Sharn sadly realized the guy wasn't even angry. Looks like he'd been expecting something like this all along. Colin pointed out they'd climbed pretty high but hadn't found any plants. Sharn suggested they split up and search. They spent hours searching for the plants. They couldn't waste any time since the poison was spreading through the emperor's system. Sharn silently begged for the plant to appear because the poison could start destroying her lord's internal organs. Suddenly, the main character cried out. She started calling for Colin, yelling with joy that she'd finally found the medicinal plant. The main character intended to pick the plant as carefully as possible so as not to damage the roots. Suddenly, there was a suspicious hiss. It was a snake, and it lunged at Sharn. The sudden attack made her scream. Colin heard her, ran over and asked what happened, all worked up. She calmly said a snake bit her, but it wasn't a big deal since it wasn't poisonous. Colin was pissed, asking if there were snakes on this hill, then wondered why she was still holding it. She asked if he was hungry, suggesting they could grill the snake for a snack. Colin yelled, "What the heck are you talking about?" She asked what was so weird about it. He wondered if she ate snakes back on her island. Sharn said they were delicious, but there wasn't time to chat. They needed to get back to the palace. Colin couldn't process any of this. The Emperor was looking better. His complexion was livelier and rosier. Sharn told the head maid that if he took the medicine every 2 hours, he'd improve noticeably. Catherine remarked she never imagined the girl was so knowledgeable, explaining she used to trade herbs back on her island. She added she just followed the advice and went to the hill, saying she doesn't know what would have happened if it weren't for the girl. The lady pointed out that one of the attackers was dressed like the head maid, meaning she was used to hurt the Emperor. Catherine was only allowed to serve the young ruler because her family was poor and powerless. She had nothing but her life. The madam noted she was incredibly happy that, thanks to Sharn, His Majesty survived, and will be able to continue to stand against the Chancellor. The woman felt like fate itself had sent such a talented girl to the palace. Sharn replied that the head maid was just flattering her. Then she thought it would be nice if the Emperor thought so too, not just Catherine. Sharn stated they needed to focus on the present, then added she wasn't familiar with the magic the attackers used. She explained that it takes some serious magic to completely control someone's mind that quickly. The more dark magic builds up, the stronger the poison gets. A normal person couldn't handle that in their system. Sharn used snakes as an example, saying they succumb to the poison and die as soon as they reach their target. Meanwhile, Albant was telling his daughter that magic isn't perfect or easy. Even creating an illusion takes a lot of effort. He pointed out the effect is stronger if the individuals look like their target, and concealing the poison requires even more care. The man smirked, because some slave was able to figure out the magic and save the Emperor. Looks like they found a diamond in the rough. The princess said her father shouldn't have weakened the poison. He should have let them die on that hill. The Prime Minister asked Diana if she couldn't handle a commoner herself without her father's help. He asked her to clarify if it was about the slave's beauty or her abilities. The princess snapped back that it wasn't about that at all. Albant remarked that a sorcerer shouldn't be reckless, and a lonely death in the mountains is too simple. Yulian has to truly suffer. The Emperor was having a dream where he was falling forever into a dark abyss, his feet never touching the ground. But it wasn't like a nightmare, because even falling into the void, Yulian felt the warmth of someone's body next to him. Opening his eyes, the Emperor saw Sharn's worried face beside him. She immediately bombarded him with questions, asking how he felt, if anything hurt. Then she guessed that the Emperor must be hungry and ran to the kitchen. Yulian, of course, tried to stop her. Suddenly, a slipper flew off the main character's foot. The girl slipped and crashed to the floor. Yulian went over and asked if she was okay, and then said there was no need to rush. She didn't react at all and didn't even move. The Emperor asked if everything was all right. Then, Sharn suddenly asked if this meant that the master was now disappointed in his personal maid. Yulian was surprised and asked what she meant. The girl retold Sir Colin's story. So, from a young age, the Emperors had to deal with a ton of messed up stuff like this. Sharn said it hit her hard back then, this awful feeling that something terrible could happen to him at any second. That's when she realized she was completely on His Majesty's side, not because of some contract, but because she genuinely felt like she had to be. Yulian noticed she was shaking and asked what was wrong. Sharn explained that His Majesty wanted her to be a shield against dark magic. But the shield cracked, and he almost died. Sharn was confident in her magic, but she still couldn't protect him. She said she broke her promise and figured he must be super disappointed in her. Suddenly, she jumped on His Majesty and started screaming at the top of her lungs that she'd fix it and never let it happen again. She swore she'd prove her worth and begged him to believe in her. Yulian grimaced and told her to get off him like now. Suddenly, it dawned on her what position they were actually in. She jumped back from the Emperor like she'd been burned and started babbling that this wasn't the proof she meant. Yulian chuckled and told her not to deny her words so desperately, since he hadn't even considered that outcome. Then he asked the maid if she really thought her lord was such a creep. Yulian held out his hand to Sharn and told her to get up since the floor was cold. The heroine felt relieved because she was genuinely afraid the emperor would get angry and suspend her from service. The girl understood that if she had been suspended, it wouldn't just be her suffering, but also Pachan, who'd signed up to be a gladiator. The heroine really wanted to succeed, especially now that the emperor wasn't looking at her as sternly as he did during their first meeting. He asked what the bandage on Sharn's ankle was about. The girl replied that an interesting situation occurred in the mountains. Sharn was about to start her story, but before the emperor could blink, the girl was lying unconscious on the floor. The main character snapped out of it for a second and asked what was going on. Catherine said it finally happened. Sharn got sick. Seeing the Lord's confusion, the headmaid pointed out that dark magic had been used for 2 days to disguise the unknown assailants as the emperor's inner circle. Then, a pie with tainted berries was baked and given to His Majesty. It almost killed him, but luckily, Sharn found some herbs that helped detoxify poison. Catherine said the personal maid spent all day preparing the medicine and stayed up all night taking care of the Lord. Then the headmaid pointed out that the girl was injured. Her ankle looked terrible. The emperor ordered Catherine to bring medicine that relieves pain and helps the wound heal. Once the headmaid ran off to get the ointment, the emperor thought it was kinda messed up. Even the woman who was supposed to be his mother ditched little Yulian, ran scared of the prime minister. And now this regular maid, who's got nothing but her own skin in the game, steps up to protect the emperor and saves his life. He couldn't wrap his head around why she was apologizing for it. Why'd she jump in front of danger like that, not even caring about getting hurt? Yulian figured from all this, Sharn must be crazy worried about him. Suddenly, Colin burst into the room, yelling that a snake bit her up in the mountains. But he wasn't getting how serious it was, 'cause Sharn seemed okay, wasn't passing out or anything. The dude checked out her hurt leg and was like, "Phew, thank goodness it's just a viper bite." Out of nowhere, the emperor shoved Colin's hand away. His Majesty said even the slightest careless touch could worsen Sharn's condition. Colin replied that hygiene was indeed important, and noted that all His Majesty's decisions had proven correct. The emperor questioned why his aide was suddenly talking like this. He explained that he meant the emperor's decision to keep giving Sharn chances. The guy pointed out that even though she was just a regular slave whose words seemed suspect, his lordship spared her, didn't kill her. Instead, he granted her freedom from her old chains and the opportunity to show her skills, to prove her worth. Colin said those were the emperor's best decisions, because Sharn is giving it her all. The emperor said they were all really lucky that this girl ended up in the palace. But luck requires good judgment, and as for Sharn, all clear thinking just seems to wash right out of the emperor's head. So, Yulian concluded that his brain is completely powerless here. The emperor himself put ointment on her leg and bandaged it up. He figured that should do the trick, but Sharn was out of it for a long time. Yulian kept saying the maid's name, begging her to wake up already. Then, out of nowhere, the main character finally opened her eyes. But everything Sharn saw was totally blurry. So, without a second thought, she called the emperor, who was sitting by the bed, Pachan, and mumbled that she missed him like crazy. She said he was the only one for her, and asked Pachan if he thought they could ever go back to the amazing island of Sursum together. The emperor wasn't offended or angry at the girl at all, since she was clearly delirious. Homesickness is natural, but Sharn was enslaved at 17 and endured harsh conditions until she was 20, when she ended up in the palace. Yulian was thinking, if Sharn and Pachan actually managed to get back to the island free, what's waiting for them? Same old, a poor and depressing life. Yulian wondered if it wouldn't make more sense to settle down in the empire to look after his own interests. And live the high life, something they definitely can't get on the island. The kid tried to tell himself it was just pillow talk, that it didn't mean anything. But these nagging thoughts just wouldn't leave him alone. He silently pleaded with Sharn to not blurt out her deepest desires so loud, because there are people out there who are green with envy for those who can dream so damn hard. A few days went by and things went back to normal. But something had shifted. The headmaid now controls everything the emperor puts in his mouth, and that's when she realized her magic was nothing compared to the chancellor's dark arts. Just being confident and wanting it bad enough isn't gonna cut it when it comes to protecting the emperor. Sharn knew that even if she leveled up her spells, there was no guarantee she could stand against Albont down the line. She was totally lost, didn't know what to do next. So in her head, she reached out to Pachan, begging him for help. One day, walking down the hall, she asked the headmaid if she could catch the gladiator training session. Catherine, all annoyed, was like, "You just want to see Pachan, that slave, don't you?" In that instant, Sharn figured Catherine would probably say no, especially with all the drama going down right now. But the woman said she could go after tea, but she had to tell His Majesty about it first. Sharn barely opened her mouth to thank the headmaid when, bam, Lady Stuart blocked her path. She said she'd heard His Majesty wasn't feeling well, so she decided to pay him a visit. Catherine greeted Princess Diana and said she'd show her to the reception room. Sharn mentally noted that Lady Stuart's appearance was significantly different from what it was at the banquet. Now she looks reserved and full of dignity, like a true empress. The princess greeted the wisest ruler and the son of this empire. Yulin said he really appreciated the young lady taking the time to visit him. And then he said that everything was ready for tea. Diana remarked that she was very worried when she learned the emperor was ill and hoped he'd made a full recovery. Yulian replied that as she could see, everything was fine now. There was a slight issue, but it was resolved a while ago. To herself, Diana fumed. How could the emperor talk about it so casually and call it a slight issue? The imperial palace was in total chaos because His Majesty ate a poisoned cake. But Yulian looks fine now, so Diana can finally breathe easy. Still, why try to off the emperor before his wedding? She wondered if the ruler could actually sense the magic. Does that slave girl from Sir's Island really have that kind of talent? Well, looks like things aren't going as smoothly as her father planned. Sharn apologized and said she needed to excuse herself. Yulian said it was fine. Sharn could go about her business, but the princess wasn't about to let the girl leave without a word. Diana asked her to remind her of her name, saying she'd forgotten, and apologized for her maid's rude behavior at the banquet. Then she asked the girl, since they practically share a husband, why not try to get along like family? The heroine was already in shock, but the next words just floored her. Diana pointed out that the question of who would give birth to the imperial heir first would be especially pressing. The girl thought to herself that she was just Her Highness's lady-in-waiting and would be happy if someone who truly loved him appeared. Besides, that would mean Sharn could finish her service and go back to their home island with Pachan. Yulian sadly thought, would Sharn leave him too? He knew the feeling of rejection. Once, little Yulian was urged to live with hatred for her, and to use that hatred to endure all the hardships of life because he would be the emperor and she a free woman. He remembered that this woman didn't shed a single tear until the very end. Yulian also tried to hold it together. Although his eyes were watering, many times he wondered if it would have been better if he had sobbed and clung to her. Maybe it would have, because all his held-back tears turned into a fear that endlessly tormented the monarch. This feels like the same thing all over again. Yulian was pulled back to reality from his own thoughts by Princess Diana's question. She asked if His Majesty was feeling unwell again. He said he was fine, just lost in thought about nothing important. As Diana looked at him, she wondered to herself if anyone could really be that gorgeous. He's like a rose with thorns, impossible to get close to. He's untouchable and unwilling to open up to anyone. But there is someone who actually managed to catch the emperor's eye. It's Sharn, born among slaves on Sir's Island, his mistress. When that girl from the island left, Diana noticed how the emperor's eyes darkened with anger. It was a deep feeling. After seeing that look, Diana finally decided that she would win His Majesty's heart at any cost. I wonder, would it be easier if she, like some silly girl, fell for Yulian's good looks? But on the other hand, her heart isn't ready to fall in love. Besides, men like him can't make a woman happy. Diana figured she'd just squeeze every last drop of advantage out of this situation. She got the idea that what she needed was a love potion, something to make her target fall head over heels. It's a long shot, but worth a try. After all, if Diana finally manages to become empress and pop out an heir, her whole life will be set. The princess told the emperor with a smile that she, of course, had prepared something for him. Julian had no idea what it was. The girl heard that if you sleep next to an aphrodisiac so it soaks up your body scent, it works even better. So she spent a few nights doing just that, but she was still worried if the potion would even work on a guy, so hung up on someone else. Suddenly, the emperor jumped up and headed somewhere. The princess tried to stop him, but all she got was an apology from the emperor. He explained that he had to take off urgently to finish some unfinished business, and he wished the princess a safe journey home. Just then, a happy Sharn ran to meet Pachan. She threw her arms around him, saying how much she'd missed him. The young man asked if Sharn was doing okay, and she replied, "Of course, I work in the imperial palace." She added that the headmaid was taking good care of her too. Pachan listened to Sharn's story with a heavy heart, sure that she was putting on a brave face. She even looked thinner than when she was a slave. He knew that even though she said everything was fine, she was actually going through a lot. Suddenly, in a serious tone, Pachan asked her to wait a little longer, until he was well trained and could beat the competition. The heroine protested, "Absolutely not! What if you get hurt in those fights?" He declared that he might look weak in her eyes, but what she sees isn't the whole story. Sharn can count on him, because if a gladiator wins against someone in the arena, they have the right to appeal to their master. Pachan said the gladiator can ask that lord for anything, and he's obligated to grant it, so the girl just needs to wait a little. The guy promised he'd definitely win so they could go back to Sursen Island together, and Sharn agreed. It was already dark when Pachan got back to the training grounds. He noticed everyone was more tense than usual, so he decided to ask what was up. They told him to look up. Pachan saw His Majesty sitting on the throne up on the platform. The guy bowed and greeted the supreme ruler and the son of this empire. Then Yulian slowly came down from the platform and asked the gladiator if his name was really Pachan. The emperor remarked that he'd heard the guy had some decent skills for a slave who came from the island. Yulian suggested the scared guy show off his gladiator skills, meet him face to face in the arena, and fight. After a moment, the gladiator stood before the emperor, sword trembling in his hands. Naturally, all the guy could do was say what a great honor it was, and that he'd give it his all. But the emperor said whether it was an honor for the kid or not would only be clear after the fight. And the fight would only end when one of them was defeated, and defeat meant death. When their blades clashed, Pachan thought it was a pretty unexpected but not totally awful opportunity. Because if he showed his stuff now, he could go home with Sharn. Pachan's hopes were dashed when it turned out the emperor was seriously skilled with a sword. Everyone was stunned, watching His Majesty's blade flash in front of the gladiator's face. Yulian knocked the guy off his feet with a flurry of attacks. Yulian was clearly getting into it, because he hissed with a nasty grin that this would be a glorious end for a slave. Suddenly, someone stopped his hand. Turns out it was Colin, who played it off like a joke, cheerfully suggesting they wrap up training and head home. His Majesty's aide glanced at the wounded Pachan and figured he kinda understood why the boss was so ticked off. But, getting rid of a useless nobody ain't gonna solve anything. Out of nowhere, the emperor called out to Colin, asking if maybe this slave should fight Marcus. The redhead guessed the boss had to be joking since Marcus was the empire's strongest gladiator, bar none. He'd won 20 fights, iced 18 guys, and crippled the other 2 for life. The emperor gave a shady smile and said he was just kidding. He only suggested it because the slave was holding his own. Suddenly, Yulian heard the wounded gladiator yelling that he couldn't just give up. He begged the boss to give him another shot, saying he'd do anything to win the fight. His Highness suggested the slave remember his place. The kid meekly replied that he really could do it. The emperor pointed out that if the slave was so confident, he should start by defeating all the gladiators here. Returning to the castle, Yulian pondered why this kid was so pathetic. Why he was doing this, why he was pushing for a fight so hard, why he was so desperately begging for another chance. Could it be because Sharn met with him behind the master's back? Is he that sweet on her? Yulian figured he shouldn't think of the girl as anything more than a simple servant, who uses magic every night to help His Majesty fall asleep since he can't do it on his own. He only has a contract with that girl, nothing more, nothing less. Suddenly, Yulian was pulled from his thoughts by his assistant's question, "Does the master like Sharn?" The emperor didn't even believe it at first and asked for clarification. Colin pointed out that he knows the Lord isn't one to fall for someone. He added that he's asking because His Majesty is acting exactly like he's got the hots for the maid. The emperor told him to think before he speaks. The guy replied that there's no reason to act so rough with the gladiator anymore. The emperor's probably pissed at Pachan because there's something going on between him and Sharn. He advised him not to overcomplicate things and not to be afraid to call it what it is, plain old jealousy. Yulian replied that the son of the empire can't just have feelings for someone like a regular dude. He should just take what he wants without getting attached. It'd be a joke if the supreme ruler was conquered by some woman's heart. Just as His Majesty was about to explain to Colin that it was a misunderstanding, Sharn showed up and cheerfully greeted the Emperor. She said she'd help the Lord and take his sword. At the maid's touch, Yulian's heart fluttered and his cheeks turned pink. The heroine noticed the sword was way heavier than it looked. Then she asked why it was covered in blood, wondering if he'd offed another warhorse this time. The Emperor was confused at first. Then he caught on and asked, "What if it's not horse blood, but human?" The heroine laughed and said that was impossible since they weren't on a battlefield. Besides, the Emperor wasn't the type to do something reckless with a weapon. He wondered if the maid actually thought highly of him, and how she'd react knowing the blood belonged to Pachan. Yulian thought to himself that Sharn really didn't know him at all, or what he was capable of to get what he wanted. She has no idea that Emperor Yulian doesn't need to feel anything for something he wants to possess. The Emperor approached the girl and asked how long she thought he could keep being nice to her. Sharn lay in bed, replaying the Emperor's words in her head about how he wasn't a good person and wasn't pretending to be. So he was wondering if this meant she was supposed to always be on his side, only serving him. Besides that, there was another thing bugging the main character too. It happened a few days back, when she brought the Lord some red thread, explaining she'd brought it special to tie around his ankle. The Emperor looked at the spool of thread suspiciously and asked if she really thought that thread was strong enough. He figured the thread probably couldn't handle it and would just snap. Sharn replied with a smile that even if it did, they could just grab another one. But then she noticed His Majesty's face suddenly darken, so she asked what was wrong. Instead of answering, the Emperor tossed the ball of thread away and grabbed Sharn by the throat. The heroine begged the master to stop, but he wouldn't budge. Her tears were already running down the Emperor's hand, but he just kept squeezing Sharn's throat harder. Suddenly, it was like he snapped out of it, and with stunned eyes, he let go of the maid. He asked what had happened. The girl noted to herself that the Emperor wasn't faking it. He was genuinely surprised and looked like he'd just woken up. No wonder His Majesty was on edge back then, considering he'd just survived an attack in his own palace. And the attackers were disguised as people he trusted completely. Meanwhile, Lady Stuart left the palace to take a walk under the starry sky. And she was thinking about how the Emperor could just up and leave like that. Even if he wasn't that into her, why be so rude? Her father once told her he didn't understand how you could be born a woman and not know how to get a man's attention. A real knockout only needs a smile and a glance, but what's the daughter got? Diana sadly realized she wasn't born a natural beauty and lacked that kind of gift, so what was she supposed to do? She couldn't even get the Emperor his stuff. Suddenly, the princess heard some strange shouts, like sounds of fighting. She wondered who could be training this late, since all the Imperial Knights should be getting ready for bed. Peeking around the corner, Diana spotted a gladiator from the Imperial court. It was Pashan. He noticed her and asked if she was lost. Diana said she'd come out for tea during a walk and somehow ended up here. She lied. The mug was actually full of booze, and meanwhile, Pachan introduced himself and stated his position. The girl thought the guy had an unusual name, and his features were pretty exotic too. Gladiator offered to escort Miss to the inner palace garden, but as soon as Diana agreed, there was a rustling in the bushes. He pulled the lady aside and told her to wait while he checked things out. Out of the bushes popped something that looked like a puppy or a kitten. The princess said it was Nobby, her cat. Her grandpa sent it. He just can't leave his wayward granddaughter alone. Of course, he doesn't want her out of his sight for a second. Pachan said he knew it all along. It was obvious the cat was just following its owner. Plus, it's got a gold collar. The girl responded positively to the guy's words, probably because she'd been drinking and was feeling a little buzzed. She felt awkward and gave him a playful look. But suddenly she screamed, because the gladiator had blood on his neck. She asked if he was hurt. Pachan replied that it was just a minor scratch he got during training. Diana was so flustered and lost in the moment, she handed the guy her handkerchief and told him to dab at the bleeding wound. Sure, she felt a pang of sadness for a second, since that handkerchief was meant for Yulian, but he probably doesn't even care about her anyway. Diana was skeptical about this whole magic thing from the start, because she didn't believe a love potion could actually work. But now she's totally convinced that was a dumb idea. Pakan thanked the princess for the handkerchief and said he didn't even know how he could ever repay her for the kindness. The girl said it was no big deal because the guy's expression reminded her of a puppy dog's face. Besides, Diana was just glad she could help out a friend who'd kept her company during her late-night walk. Sometime later, the emperor was holding a meeting with the nobles in a special hall. Lord Albont inquired about the emperor's health from now on. He said, being an old man, he was incredibly worried when he heard the young ruler wasn't feeling well. Julian just smirked, staring right into the chancellor's defiant eyes. He said there was nothing to worry about. It was just some low-down, dirty trick from a hater. The chancellor pointed out the emperor's amusing choice of words, but wondered if it wasn't a little inappropriate. The man reminded Julian that he'd taught him since childhood to watch what he said and did. All the other members of parliament cringed in fear and sat silently, quiet as mice. Albont thought that just because His Majesty was getting a little bolder didn't mean they could walk all over him. He asked about a hunting tournament, pointing out that his estate's land was perfect for hunting grounds. Then the Prime Minister added that he was only suggesting it to celebrate His Majesty's recovery. Julian said it sounded interesting, but he wasn't inclined to participate. Because organizing such an event and handling that many people would take a considerable amount of effort. Forget about getting any funding. The Chancellor just laughed and told me not to worry about it. Said since he's throwing the event, he'll make damn sure everything's perfect. No screw-ups allowed. Then he apologized and said he had to run. Colin asked if a hunting tournament on the Chancellor's land sounds fishy, right? His Majesty explained that Albante clearly wants to show everyone he's more capable than the Emperor. But I'm not gonna let Albante get away with this so easily. Looks like he thinks the Emperor's plate is his personal playground for messing around. Julian suggested we teach the Chancellor a lesson about messing with things that don't belong to him, if you catch my drift. Colin pointed out that the Chancellor's lands are basically enemy territory. Who knows what kind of trouble's lurking there? To top it off, the Chancellor has a serious private army. The Emperor asked if there wasn't a safer, smarter way to handle this. The aide had a brilliant idea. Maybe His Majesty could actually use his good looks to his advantage for once. The Emperor was clueless at first, but his aide explained this was the perfect time to really cash in on his looks. I mean, seducing Lady Dana Stewart and getting her on our side would be a seriously effective play. The Emperor bristled, asking why the aide didn't try this sleazy tactic himself if he liked it so much. Over the years, Albont had sent tons of spies, including knockout beauties, but none of them could win His Majesty's favor. Back then, Colin had overestimated the emotionless lord's capacity for love, but now things were different. The redhead added that Lady Stewart was a shoo-in for Empress, but what happened after that was up to the Emperor. Julian asked what the aide meant, and Colin advised his lord to see it as a strategy to hold on to the throne. He reminded His Majesty that he'd vowed to live solely as an emperor, not as a regular guy. Julian remarked that was spot on because he swore to cut anything from his heart that didn't lead to the throne. The Emperor thought that if he decided to go for it, he could use the Chancellor's daughter however he wanted. Colin's right. The key is to possess without getting caught up in feelings or emotions. But is it really that simple? Julian realized he was just a little thrown off. He'd never felt like this before. It'll pass soon. For the Emperor, having feelings is a deadly weakness. Better nip it in the bud. After a while, something interesting was happening in the Imperial Palace. Lady Stewart thanked His Majesty for the invitation. The Emperor warmly greeted his guest and invited her to the table. She remarked that she'd given it some thought and realized her words last time came off a little harsh. The Emperor asked her to clarify what happened at their last meeting. The princess asked if he didn't remember. The girl reminded him that she visited the palace without warning and distracted the Emperor, not even realizing how busy he was. His Majesty apologized because leaving in the middle of a conversation was definitely impolite. Diana felt like this conversation was suffocating her. Talking to Julian was as tough as talking to her dad. She decided to change the subject and mention that her father was working hard to get ready for the hunting tournament. The Emperor replied that he was looking forward to it. Just then, Sharn showed up. The princess asked if Julian had invited her for lunch. The girl said she brought wine, hoping the princess would appreciate its taste together. She added that she wouldn't intrude and would be on her way. The girl saw that they were deep in conversation, probably busy with their own stuff. Diana stopped Sharn and asked if she was really just going to leave like that, suggesting she stay for at least one toast. The girl was shocked and replied that she appreciated the offer but didn't drink. The princess insisted that she sit down. The emperor added that it was impolite to refuse the good intentions of your elders. Sharn had no choice but to agree. The princess smiled and told Sharn that it turned out they were on the same page about this. She admitted a noblewoman should know her wines, but her taste buds were straight up staging a rebellion. Yulian said this wine was made for lunch, so it wasn't too strong, and Lady Diana would be fine. The main character thought the emperor's voice was so gentle, she didn't even know he could talk like that. The princess asked, since His Majesty was being so insistent, how could she possibly refuse? The empire's ruler and the daughter of the noble Stuart family are a perfect match. Now Sharn finally understood. She also realized her true status and remembered that she was just a simple slave. The whole court already knows His Majesty's episodes have calmed down. So once this political marriage goes off without a hitch, the main character can finally ditch this palace. But even now, does Sharn have to keep up the act, pretending she's loving His Majesty's attentions? The girl remarked that the emperor and princess made a harmonious couple. Diana thanked her. She said Sharn looked good with the emperor too, but the heroine thought it was all fake. They were just drinking and laughing together. The princess asked if Sharn thought there was someone who suited her better. After that question, the emperor started staring intently at the maid, watching her reaction. The main character got flustered. Yulian grimaced and said the meat was tasty but tough. Diana noticed Sharn's negative reaction, so she decided to change the subject. Diana was worried because the tournament required horseback riding, and she was a total newbie. The emperor suggested the princess go to the tournament together. At first, she hesitated, remembering Sharn's reaction. But after thinking for a bit, Diana agreed, smirking and noting that the island girl probably got along with horses. The main character had no choice but to agree, even though she'd only worked in the stables before, and as a slave, she couldn't ride. Those memories hit her so hard she just wanted to drown her sorrows. Naturally, the princess and the emperor didn't miss a thing. The main character was surprised by the great taste and suddenly understood why people loved booze so much. Sharn licked her lips, looking satisfied, and Yulian was totally stunned. He chuckled to himself, noting how wide-eyed his subordinate looked. But then he wondered, why are you staring at Sharn like that when she's just a personal servant? The emperor thought to himself, puzzled, even though she belongs to me, I look at her like she's some priceless treasure I can't have. Diana caught that look and thought how touching it was. He's burning for her, and she doesn't even notice. Clearly, her feelings for him are nowhere near as strong as his obsession with her. Diana figured that to become empress, she needed to avoid trouble, especially with Sharn, because that could get ugly. Sharn's apologizing for her behavior, promising she won't touch another drop of booze. But she jokes that the emperor himself offered the wine, so everyone's gotta obey and try it. Sharn's had it with her pointless life. She thought a glass of wine might help, even for a second. Then she apologized and booked it out of there, clearly embarrassed and upset about the whole thing. The emperor couldn't help but watch the maid as she walked away. After the meal, Yulian spent a lot of time thinking about his feelings for Sharn, and he inwardly acknowledged how messed up he felt inside. He called himself a fool since he's been trying to forget Sharn for ages, but he can't get her out of his head. Yulian said to himself with a hint of sarcasm that he probably won't be able to sleep again tonight, and he wondered where his personal maid was, now when he really needed her. Suddenly, Catherine showed up, surprised to see His Majesty had already returned. He asked the head maid where Sharn was, looking around worried. The maid noticed the girl had been having dinner with the emperor. She added that she'd just been cleaning and checked all the rooms, but Sharn was nowhere to be found. The emperor said the maid was right, explaining that Sharn had a bit too much wine and probably went out for some fresh air. Catherine pointed out that Sharn never just disappears, especially when the master needs his sleep medication. The emperor was in despair, wondering how his thoughts and dreams had become completely controlled by another person. His Majesty is covering up the search for the servant, even though Catherine tried to object. He said she was probably just out in the garden somewhere, nothing to worry about. But even after getting back and changing, Yulian couldn't calm down or shake off the worried thoughts about Sharn. Despite the late hour, he left his chambers and headed off somewhere. The guards tried to stop him, but he ordered them to shut their traps and stay put. Julian's chest tightened, his heart hammered, and he tried to keep it together, despite the anxiety eating at him. Suddenly it clicked. That's where Sharn went. She obviously headed straight for that slave. The Emperor was stuck on Diana's question. Does Sharn think there's someone better for her out there? Seriously? It's a joke that some low-life slave is getting the Emperor this worked up. It suddenly hit Julian. Sharn's actions were a flat-out betrayal of her master. This is the third time she's vanished without a trace, blowing off her duties. Passing by the stables, His Majesty noticed a light spilling out. Deciding to peek inside, the Emperor found Sharn passed out cold on the hay. He wondered, did the girl really tie one on that hard? She must be out of it to sleep so soundly, but this is really out of character for her. Julian was floored, totally speechless, but he still decided to carry the maid inside the palace. The guy reminded himself that he'd decided once and for all to ditch any feelings for his personal maid. He knew that if he took her back into the palace now, he'd never be able to get her out of his head later. Julian gently stroked Sharn's cheek and wondered to himself, what the heck was he supposed to do with her now? Night had already fallen. As usual, Princess Diana went for an evening stroll after dinner. She was plotting to take over the empire, analyzing her father's and the Emperor's weaknesses. Of course, the ideal scenario would be if she had a son, and in the end, he was the only one left standing. Then the empire would be hers for the taking. But to get that plan rolling, she needed those two in the mix. But the Emperor's head over heels for some other chick, and the Prime Minister's a wild card because of his greed. Diana was stuck. She had no idea how to take over this country. She figured she'd have to put up with those two for now, use them to reach her goal. But the princess was a cold pragmatist, ready to ditch them if they became a problem down the line. The moon was high and shining bright. Diana thought nights like this called for getting wasted. Too bad she played it safe and held back. She'd rather be plastered than pretend. Her Highness told her maid she didn't need an escort anymore. She wanted to walk alone. Suddenly something caught the girl's eye. Polished stones glittered on the ground. The find seemed suspicious, like it was all staged. Maybe it's a marker or a trap, but then Diana remembered her recent meeting with Pachan. He'd asked her if she'd just happened to get lost during her walk. So Her Highness figured out the guy intentionally left a marker thinking the princess was lost again? Suddenly, she heard some kind of noise. Meanwhile, back at the Imperial Palace, they were tearing the place apart looking for the main character. Colin was griping about being tired, saying he didn't get why the Emperor was so obsessed with finding Sharn. It was weird. The redhead smirked at his mom's behavior, 'cause she was acting all indifferent, but she was totally freaking out inside. She told him not to stop searching and to keep the guards ready, because Sharn was crucial for the Emperor to get any sleep. Colin wondered if His Majesty had finally made a decision. Catherine asked him what he meant by that. The guy shot back that she knew exactly what he was talking about. The head maid realized her son was hinting at the, thing between the Emperor and his personal servant, the one everyone sees but nobody talks about. The madam went ballistic, yelling at her son and denying everything, calling their relationship just a performance. Julian's a total fanatic when it comes to his interests. Books, fencing, whatever. He sees it through to the bitter end. Put simply, he's way more ruthless than he looks. That soft exterior hides a will of steel. He's not the type to let someone go just because he loves them. For Julian, love is about having, not freeing. That stubbornness could extend to Sharn. Catherine said that's why she's trying to stop this obsession before his lordship completely loses it. Sharn has an unbreakable will. She fights for her independence despite being a subordinate. She's like a little fish, always slipping through your fingers when you try to grab her. Catherine said Colin's job is to make sure His Majesty never fully realizes his feelings, to let him think it was just a fleeting illusion. The redhead pondered, was the price of the Lord's peace a well-intentioned deception? But who really benefits? Colin was outraged by the absurdity of it all. He realized they were asking him to suppress the Emperor's feelings under the guise of the Empire's well-being. The Imperial aide knew that Sharn, as a former slave, could hide in a secluded and hard-to-reach place. Suddenly he heard some kind of noise. Listening closely, Colin realized it was laughter coming from around the corner. But when the guy peeked around the corner, it took his breath away. He saw Pachan and Princess Diana getting cozy. Colin watched the secret rendezvous with surprise, wondering what they were doing, strolling together under the moonlight. And more importantly, Pachan is the guy Sharn has a crush on. But judging by his facial expression and behavior, it doesn't look like he's intimidated by Princess Diana at all. Colin noted with annoyance that of all times His Majesty was nowhere to be found. But at that moment, the Emperor was busy with something important. He couldn't admit he needed Sharn not just as a remedy, but as someone he loved, so he was hiding behind paperwork. The contract with Sharn remains in effect until his insomnia is cured and the Emperor gets married. That explains why Sharn can't just be let go, no matter her status or feelings. Keeping Sharn close is also important for political reasons, since Albert's a threat to the throne. Until he's neutralized, the Emperor needs Sharn. Yulian decided to turn around and leave, since the Emperor's promise has to be kept. But not even a minute passed before he came running back in a panic. 'Cause like a true gentleman, the Emperor can't just leave a tipsy woman alone. Only real lowlifes do that. Yulian convinced himself he'd just watch over her until dawn, then he'd come back like nothing happened. Sharn was kicking herself, thinking she must have totally lost it, since she passed out drunk in the stables. Just as Sharn thought, if the headmaid finds out, I'm toast. An unhappy Sharn appeared right in front of her face, and the girl freaked out. She said, we're shipping out to the river's hunting competition tomorrow, so we need to get everything prepped ASAP. Also, gotta make sure His Majesty is comfortable, and I'm swearing off booze starting today, cold turkey. A little later, Sharn went to see the Emperor in his chambers, apologizing with her eyes downcast. She explained she had zero memory of getting back to her room last night, and she should have woken up earlier to get breakfast ready. The Emperor said coldly that even a little wine at dinner can apparently knock you senseless. Sharn was a wreck. Her trembling fingers gave away her fear. The Emperor was deliberately talking down to her, watching her blush. The girl timidly suggested she withdraw from the hunt, since she'd only be a hindrance to His Majesty and the princess. Yulian didn't even catch what the maid was saying at first. Then she clarified she just wanted them to get along. His Majesty advised the maid not to make things up and just do her job. He told her to stay out of things that don't concern her and know her place. It's not a servant's job to be curious about the future empress. The day of the hunting tournament is finally here. The guests started whispering, all riled up like, where the heck is the monarch's main squeeze? They were asking like, shocked, did the Emperor finally pick Diana? Others were saying, trying to figure out that guy is a total mind-bender. Suddenly, Julian's eyes went wide and the other nobles couldn't look away either. Everyone there was staring at the stunning Sharn. The gossips started whispering again, asking, is that the girl the Emperor's been favoring? They were saying, yeah, the rumors about her beauty are true, but who's that guy sitting next to her? The nobles were wondering why they were riding together, and watching all this, Diana was bummed, wondering what they were up to. Before they left, Colin told the Emperor he'd handle everything today so he shouldn't sweat it. So Yulian agreed and said he trusted the guy. But now he regretted his decision, sighing with bitterness because Sharn and Colin looked even more perfect together than he'd imagined. It was like the royal wedding had already happened. Suddenly, Sharn gasped in surprise, because the headmaid was riding past her, looking absolutely stunning. Catherine said sadly, it's a shame women can't be knights because she'd totally crush it. Colin suggested to his mom with a smile that they have a race to see who could get to the river first on horseback. He added that he missed their competitions, but Catherine replied indulgently, saying, don't waste your energy, because she'd still win. The guy asked if the Emperor would compete, who then asked his assistant sternly if he really thought the Lord got to the throne by accident. Catherine shouted that she'd ride first. Colin said that if his mom were a knight, she'd be braver than Jalek. Sharn wanted to double-check, is he talking about that knight who put a curse on the royal family? Colin confirmed it, saying that back then, she was executed after being falsely accused of witchcraft. Now her name's been cleared, and history's finally set the record straight. Sharn wondered if they really offed her, even after all her loyalty to the kingdom. She was also thrown off by how chill Colin was being about the whole thing. She yelled at Colin to pick up the pace or he'd be dead last. He chuckled and said it's one thing when someone you care about pulls ahead, but it's way worse when they just vanish completely. Sharn asked what he meant by that, but Colin just brushed it off, saying it was nothing, especially since Mom was going to be the first one to the river. But he thinks His Majesty's been looking over his shoulder after every step lately. She agreed, saying the boss has been acting weird lately. Colin asked her what kind of weird she was talking about. She said the Emperor's been giving her the cold shoulder lately. Sharn wondered if she'd screwed something up that made His Majesty so distant. She also figured there might be something else going on she didn't know about, but she was ready to do whatever it took to fix it. Colin told her not to sweat it. The Emperor's always been a bit of an ice king. Sharn replied that this was different, like the Emperor didn't even want her around. She said all this tension was really wearing her down. She'd rather shovel manure than walk on eggshells every single day. Meanwhile, the scene shifts to the Chancellor's estate. A mouse scurried toward a discarded apple core when suddenly there was a rustling in the bushes. A cat leaped out, and in a flash, the small, defenseless creature was history. So, the audience gets to guess what the author was trying to say. And if it was even an allegory for anything? Finally, all the guests have arrived for the hunting tournament and are settling into their tents. As expected, Colin and Sharn were last to arrive. The guy said he needed to pay his respects to His Majesty first. He asked what Sharn would be doing, but she said she'd just chill in the shade for now. Colin promised to catch up later, and the girl headed toward the trees and accidentally bumped into Princess Diana. Diana chirped happily, saying she was so glad to finally see Sharn here. The heroine was confused and clearly not thrilled about this encounter. The princess said she was just about to chat with the ladies-in-waiting. Sharn didn't really want to, but she didn't have a choice. Meanwhile, Colin was asking the Emperor if he wasn't curious why the assistant and Sharn were late. Julian raised an eyebrow condescendingly and said he was aware of the assistant's riding skills. The guy replied that wasn't exactly it. It's just that he and the girl had a very engaging conversation on the way. He mumbled, all hurt, asking if the Emperor really didn't care what they talked about. His Majesty just shut him down, saying he didn't want to know a thing. Colin kept rambling on about how well he and Sharn were getting along, and it wasn't until Julian, totally ticked off, grabbed for his sword that the redhead finally got the picture. He said he needed to go check up on a new friend. But as he was leaving the Emperor's tent, he saw Albert with the secretary. Well, that's a fine how do you do. A visit from the Chancellor to the Emperor never means anything good, though His Majesty seems to be keeping it together. Colin wondered if he should have trusted his gut when he put Lady Stuart in front of him on the horse. But it's best not to meddle where you don't belong. Until recently, Julian Dine was as desirable to him as Albert was. But now, even if he doesn't like it, he's accepted reality and his fate. After all, the weight of the crown is always heavy. Anyway, it all worked out for the best. There was nothing, and could never be anything, between Sharn and the Emperor. Now each of them will accept the destiny laid out for them in their respective places. Someone said this was a prime opportunity to check out the Chancellor's pad. They say it was built by a famous architect from the Florence Empire, calling it a true work of art. Albert chuckled and insisted it was nothing special, just saw a cozy farmhouse in Florence and decided to build something similar. Julian smirked, thinking what a nerve it was to call a luxurious mansion, built with the people's taxes, a farmhouse. The monarch was amazed by Albert's fake modesty. He just wanted to flaunt it in front of the nobles, just to show how much power the Chancellor of Waldeck had, that his wealth surpassed even the imperial family. That to a seasoned politician like him, the young emperor was nothing more than a kid. Julian grinned and said he was also curious to take a look at the Chancellor's magnificent palace. Then he clarified that he almost forgot to call the palace a farmhouse. Albert forced a smile and said it was really just a farmhouse, not worthy of showing to the Emperor. Julian dryly remarked that it was a real shame, while thinking to himself that the Chancellor was a greedy old geezer. The cat hopped off the Chancellor's lap, ready for a stroll and a little hunt. By the way, nobody seemed to notice that the cat's collar was smeared with blood. Meanwhile, the ladies were having tea, gossiping about the Emperor's rather charming behavior towards Lady Stuart today. Diana chirped shyly, saying that if it was that obvious, she was feeling a little embarrassed now. Sharn caught a pleasant floral scent, like she was deep in the woods. The aroma was like being back on her home island of Cerson. Then the princess spoke to her, asking if she liked the tea. The princess explained that it was one of the signature blends produced within the empire. Diana said playfully that unlike wine, the tea was hot, so Sharn shouldn't gulp it all down at once. Sharn thanked the princess for her concern and overheard the ladies-in-waiting snickering, trying to hide their contempt. One of the girls apologized, saying if she's from Sursen Island, then it makes sense she doesn't know basic etiquette. Her friend told Sharn she should learn some manners instead of just picking out outfits, 'cause you can't hold a guy's attention with just your looks forever. The main character was pissed and shocked by the princess's ladies-in-waiting coming at her like that. So the princess wasn't worried about Sharn, she just wanted to put her down. There's nothing going on between His Majesty and the island girl, and yet Lady Stuart's still fuming. A woman who's just pretty on the outside can't heal the Emperor's wounded heart and build a real connection with him. Is that why His Majesty's been so cold lately? Did Sharn screw something up? The blonde said she didn't expect the roles of Emperor's favorite and princess to switch so fast. She added that the princess managed to grab His Majesty's attention, which is why your true character matters. The princess smiled and said she was surprised. She didn't expect His Majesty to open up to her so quickly. Some lady-in-waiting said the Emperor finally saw Lady Stuart's inner beauty. Suddenly they asked Sharn if she was upset about it. The princess figured those words probably hit a little too hard. She told her not to take it so personally. One of the ladies summed it up, saying it's pretty pathetic when you've got nothing and you're desperately clinging to a guy who's already moved on. That really ticked off our main character. And then it hit her. This whole tea party was set up to make fun of her. She realized she messed up trusting Diana and agreeing to chat. This is just like that dinner all over again. Just then, the headmaid showed up with a tray of sweets and chirped that she was so happy the aristocrats had welcomed Sharn into their circle. She added that it was nice to see the ladies getting along so well. Looks like everyone likes her, except for Lady Eaton, of course. The princess scoffed, asking since when the headmaid gave a damn about Sharn. Catherine replied that she understood something the night of that weird dinner, that all the Empire's attention was focused in one place. Diana knew what the headmaid meant and wasn't happy about it. I wonder if the viewers have figured out what was implied by that. The woman admitted that Sharn really did drink a lot of wine that night, went out to the garden for some fresh air, but didn't come back until late. She said that the Emperor was so worried about Lady Sharn that he searched for her all night to bring her back to the palace. For some reason, Diana concluded with a satisfied smile, so that's what happened that night. Catherine thought, honestly, she didn't know where Sharn was or what she was doing that night. But just before dawn, she ran into the Emperor, looking rumpled and exhausted. She asked where His Majesty had been all that time, if he was having another bout of insomnia. Catherine said Sharn still hadn't returned, but the Emperor replied there was no need to look for her. The woman was stunned. The Emperor asked that when Sharn returns, just act like nothing happened. As the Emperor walked by, the headmaid noticed straw falling off him and wondered, had the master been in the stables all this time? At the thought of the stables, Catherine immediately thought of Sharn. Princess Diana laughed and said she was worried for nothing. But Catherine replied that she wasn't. The kind and sensitive heart of the girl from the island couldn't be at fault. Lady Stuart was outraged, saying she hadn't expected things to turn out this way. The princess's friends were also shocked by the headmaid's words, one of them concluding that Diana was terribly humiliated in that case. With feigned regret, Lady Stuart said that Sharn shouldn't have been dragged into this, and she was deeply grateful that Catherine told her this. Out of nowhere, she said she remembered she had to rush and visit her dad to give him the lowdown after arriving. The princess's friends said they'd do the same and thanked Sharn for the good time. When only Sharn was left at the table, Catherine said she'd worked so hard making the dessert, and now it'd all go to waste. She complained that the ladies could have at least tried a bite before leaving. Then Sharn asked if the headmaid's story about His Majesty's actions that night was true. Catherine said the girl already knew everything, since His Majesty can't sleep soundly without her. Suddenly, it hit the heroine why the Emperor looked so rough that day, and why he'd suddenly become so cold. Obviously, he was just exhausted because he spent the whole night searching for his personal maid. So what Sharn saw that night wasn't just her imagination. She realized she'd let His Majesty down yet again. The main character was desperate to figure out how to fix this screw-up. Suddenly, Albert's snow-white cat bolted into Sharn and Catherine's tent. Nobody had noticed the blood smeared on its collar until now. The head maid was surprised to see the cat there, especially since it had a bell, meaning it belonged to someone. Sharn was mentally griping about how anyone could call that thing a cat. It looked more like a cat-dog hybrid. Catherine declared they needed to find its owner ASAP and reached out to pet it. But in that instant, the animal bared its razor-sharp claws and scratched the madam's hand. Sharn immediately rushed over to the head maid to see if she was okay. Catherine replied that she just yelped from the surprise, but it was nothing serious, really. Just then, Sharn heard the princess calling out the animal's name. Diana sternly called out Nabi again, saying she'd finally found her. She was saying the cat needed to learn a lesson, 'cause scratching people for no reason is just bad manners. Sharn was racking her brain like she'd definitely heard that name somewhere before. So this is the Nabi that Lady Eaton was warning us about. Colin ran into the tent and convinced Mom to bandage her up, but Catherine just brushed it off, said it was nothing, just a scratch from the cat. But even after the doctor came, the head maid wasn't getting any better. She'd cry out in pain every so often, and sometimes the wound would throb and burn like crazy. Sharn said that black poison was seeping from the wound. A normal person wouldn't see it without magic knowledge, but to her it was crystal clear. The heroine figured she was right all along, that it was the animal's fault. Looks like the Chancellor isn't keeping a cat, but some kind of monster. The girl stated that its claws were laced with poison, which is why the head maid was suffering so badly. Colin and Catherine just stared at Catherine, totally dumbfounded. Sharn said human medicine won't cut it, and since the Chancellor's magic cooked up this beast, we're in deep trouble. The girl added, there's only one way out. We gotta take out Nabi. Only then will the poison and the curse break. Colin wasn't thrilled with that idea, obviously, but it was the only way to save the head maid. Catherine was pissed, saying life's a real roller coaster, but there's no way we can let His Majesty know about this. Sharn grabbed Sir Colin and started whispering something in his ear. Just then, the Emperor showed up at the tent. No sooner did Julian step inside than he noticed Sharn touching his aide. But instead of explaining, Sharn bolted from the tent, shouting apologies that she and Colin had to rush off. The Emperor watched them go with a look that could kill. Sharn said she almost had a heart attack running into His Majesty on the way over here. Then she looked at Colin and asked what was up with his face, but he just said he was fine. He asked what she wanted to talk about in private, and she asked if he could give her a dagger. She added that she felt like she needed to handle this herself, without anyone else getting involved. The guy's eyes went wide, and he asked if Sharn was thinking of doing this herself. She cut him off, saying that's exactly what she meant. She summed it up. She wanted to take care of Nabi with her own 2 hands. And she explained that if it got out that the Chancellor's pet was a monster, and that it attacked the housekeeper, things would spiral out of control. The hunting tournament would turn into a battlefield, and since it's the Chancellor's territory, all the factors would be stacked against His Majesty. Colin seriously doubted this plan. He asked Sharn if she was really sure she could handle this alone. The girl agreed, but mentioned that she'd need his help to distract the Chancellor. Sharn said that if Colin could create a diversion, she'd go after Nabi and put an end to it before Catherine's injuries got any worse. Sharn figured since she was in this hunting tournament, she might as well give it a shot. She used to swing sticks around in the yard all the time as a kid. The hunt kicked off and everyone headed into the woods. Diana finally caught up to His Highness and excitedly called out, "There he is!" She wanted to see the Emperor before the hunt started. She was wondering if her family's land met the Emperor's standards, even though the Chancellor's estate was already famous, right? Meanwhile, Julian was barely listening to the princess, his eyes glued on Colin and Sharn, who he thought were standing way too close. He was wondering, what the heck are they talking about? Even as Julian galloped his horse across the rivers, he didn't look back, his gaze fixed forward. But then, his senses reached out like a spider web, making him unconsciously keep tabs on Sharn and Colin. At the same time, Albert was getting hyped for the hunt, asking his favorite dogs if they missed the taste of action. He promised he'd give them some fun soon, and finally, the starting shot rang out. The gunshot spooked the birds and they started squawking like crazy. The dogs went nuts, barking and taking off. Sharn and Colin watched, totally curious, as the Chancellor booked it after them like a madman. Out of the corner of his eye, Albert spotted Sharn's figure hiding behind a tree. The Chancellor chuckled, realizing someone was tailing him. He said it was time for Nabi to cut loose. He told her to go wild. Colin shouted to Sharn, worried that Nabi was headed her way and to watch out. She said she was ready and told Sir Colin to be careful too. Sharn gripped her sword, thinking to herself that Nabi was never going back to her master. Nabi charged in, and Sharn planned to jump out and yell for her to freeze. But that stupid stick ruined everything. As the girl untangled herself, her eyes landed on a magnificent building. Weird that such a gorgeous house is so deep in the woods. Could this splendor really belong to the Chancellor? Sharn wondered, could this be the mansion she'd heard so much about at the pre-hunt tea parties? They said Albert's fancy estate was somewhere in this forest. That's why Nabi found it so fast. No sweat. The girl figured this could make things easier. If she could drive the cat inside, taking it out would be a cinch. The garden's immaculate, but there's nobody around. It was dark and creepy inside the mansion, probably 'cause the house is surrounded by thick woods. Sharn was thinking, where the heck did that animal hide? She was trying to figure out what kind of monster Nabi really was. If it was created with magic, destroying it won't be easy. Suddenly, the girl heard the faint jingle of Nabi's collar. Could that bloodthirsty beast be right behind her? It happened in a flash. Nabi's claws didn't just scratch Sharn, they tore her up bad. The girl was moaning from the pain of the wound on her neck, but Nabi was bracing for the next attack. So she kept telling herself to stay calm, just get this thing over with. The author's keeping us on the edge of our seats, now we're in the woods, and the Emperor's taking a shot. Bullseye! Yulian took down the deer. A crowd of nobles swarmed the Emperor, gushing about how amazing he is, as always. One even said they wanted to learn from him. Albert was watching all this with a sour look. His secretary said it would be awkward if the princess were here, because then she'd have to choose between her future husband and her loving father. Albert scoffed, saying the boy emperor was really eating this up. Then, with a smirk, he asked if this could really last. He was loving it since he'd carefully created and trained his cat. One touch of this animal's claws or teeth, and the emperor's beloved woman will be pushing up daisies. The chancellor wondered what kind of face the emperor would make when they found her body cold and lifeless. The hunting competition's over. Sharn should be back by now. Colin's starting to sweat. A terrible thought hit him. What if she was the prey, or something bad happened? The emperor snuck up on him and asked what had him so lost in thought. Colin jumped, startled, and said the emperor scared him. The emperor asked why he'd been wearing such a serious face since the tournament started. The guy asked if things were really that bad, and said he'd explain later. The emperor reminded him that he had the same look on his face when he found out his first love fell for the prince next door. He grabbed Colin and hissed through his teeth that if this lowlife didn't want to end up pushing up daisies, he'd better start talking. Then the emperor's aide confessed that Sharn went after a Nabi. Yulian asked him to repeat that, thinking he misheard, but Colin said it again. And he added that it could be super dangerous right now. The emperor was totally baffled. So the guy gave him the whole story, quick and dirty, ending with, if they don't off that cat, his mother's life is on the line. Colin filled the lord in on the plan. While he was running interference, Sharn was tracking the creature. Yulian was furious, blowing a gasket, asking why his aide hadn't said anything. Colin reminded him that His Majesty needed to stay focused on Princess Diana. Besides, the guy didn't want to stir up trouble in the Chancellor's territory, not while his mom was there. He declared he was ready to own this, do whatever it takes to get her back, 'cause she might have been poisoned by some monster venom. The Emperor shot back that the guy didn't have to do any of that. He went on, saying he didn't see the point in going the extra mile. Those words cut deep. Finally, it hit Yulian like a ton of bricks. His emotions just steamrolled right over his cold logic. You can't just toss him aside like trash. I tried everything, but nothing worked. Every attempt was a dead end. He said Sharn was his, so he's going after her. Meanwhile, the main girl was fighting tooth and nail against some seriously savage beast. Sharn froze for a second, seeing purple blood dripping down the blade. That could only mean one thing. She realized with a jolt that she was facing a real fur-covered nightmare. The thought hit Sharn like a punch to the gut. If she hesitated now, it'd be game over. In her mind, she reached out to Nami, asking her to remember her face, because this was it. Sharn charged and swung the dagger, but the cat managed to bolt at the last second. The girl asked what was so funny and laughed. The sound was way too loud in the empty palace. The monster writhed like an eel, dodging the dagger. Suddenly, the elusive thing lunged at the heroine and bit her. I bet you guys can imagine the colorful language Sharn was using on that beast. Her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't afford to screw up like that again. She decided her next strike had to be dead on. Sharn swallowed hard, gripping the dagger tighter. When the cat tried to pounce on Sharn again, she focused every ounce of her strength. And the dagger sank right into the target, blood splattering across the floor. Exhausted, Sharn collapsed to the floor, barely catching her breath. Looking around, she whispered, "Where's that lowlife?" Her hand tightened on the sword hilt. She felt in her gut that the enemy would appear right now, when she was almost out of juice. Weakness and tremors ran through her muscles. Her legs gave way and she fell. My vision blurred, but blacking out now was basically a death sentence. Sharn kept telling herself to hang on, not to give in, when suddenly she heard footsteps outside the door. The doors burst open, and Sharn saw the Emperor standing there. He immediately leaned over her, said her name in a gentle voice, and told her he knew everything. Yulian asked if she had managed to find and eliminate that cat, Albert. But Sharn didn't say anything, so he tried to ask again. Instead of answering, she just let out a scream filled with emotion. From the start, Yulian was sure Sharn would end up wherever he was going. There was no logical explanation. But he felt this invisible thread connecting him to Sharn, so he moved forward, following his gut. The Emperor's mind clouded over with worry. Haunted by terrible visions, he was furious that she always tried to shoulder the most dangerous burdens. And yet, when Sharn saw her savior, all she could do was blurt out something about some kind of monster. She rattled on about how it wasn't just some mutt or stray animal. According to her, it was a mutated creature, something unnatural, created by witchcraft. Yulian admitted he'd already heard that from Colin, but he wanted to know why she hadn't said anything to him. He was fuming, asking if Sharn had completely lost her mind, going up against something that dangerous on her own? He asked what Sharn would have done if she'd kicked the bucket before he arrived, and why she always takes everything on herself. The girl replied that she didn't want to bother His Majesty, and besides, this is the Chancellor's territory. She added that only one thing matters now, making sure that Beast stops breathing. The heroine explained that she wounded the thing a few times, so it must be hiding somewhere in the mansion. Sharn said they needed to make sure it's dead, and the Emperor replied that he understood. Then, with a concerned voice, he said the girl had already done enough and needed to rest. Yulian whispered that he would take care of everything else. Suddenly, Pachin appeared before the girl's eyes, disappearing into the water. She yelled at him to hold on tight. But in an instant, everything vanished, and the main character wondered if it had all been just a dream. The girl felt an intense heat, looked around and realized everything was on fire. His Majesty stood in the center of the blaze, and she thanked him for letting her rest. The Emperor didn't react at all. Then she finally managed to shout at him and ask if he was okay. The main character asked what to do since the mansion was destroyed. How could they explain it to the Chancellor? Yulian replied that he didn't care, even if Albert insisted on investigating this incident. He was saying he wasn't feeling too hot, like his ticker was skipping a beat or something. Sharn got all worked up, asking him to be specific, if it was some kind of heart thing. The Emperor clarified that his heart just wasn't listening to him anymore. And then, boom, he went right for the main character's lips. But the girl yelped, totally shocked, and shoved His Majesty away. She yelled, asking what in the world he thought he was doing. Then Yulian announced he'd made a decision, and Sharn begged the Emperor to say nothing. He was surprised, asking why not, and she shot back with how she could possibly deal with him having feelings for her. Emperor Valdeka had fallen head over heels for a maid from Cirsa Island. Even though he's got a noble lady right there, way more suitable to be Empress, Sharn knew she was just under contract with the Emperor, playing a part, nothing more. She had to remember her place. Yulian told her that it was already too late to run, it was all decided, and even he couldn't undo it. He explained that he tried to escape, scared by these crazy feelings, but his desires got all tangled up like a knotted cord. The young man told her he couldn't fight it anymore. He had to admit he craved Sharn, not just the throne. She'd taken hold of him just like the hunger for power. Now even his cold heart is burning. All the aristocrats, including Yulian and Albert, gathered at the Chancellor's palace. The emperor said he understood the chancellor was upset about the fire at his mansion, but it was unavoidable. Albert smirked sarcastically, asking if there really wasn't anything that could have been done. He went on, saying he'd never seen anything so unavoidable in his life. His Majesty said that if the chancellor's cat hadn't been a monster to begin with, none of this would have happened. He explained that the animal had attacked his personal attendant and head maid, and to take care of it they had to deal with the estate. The emperor reminded the chancellor that he knew the right thing to do when something tainted. Someone was to get rid of it. The nobles whispered that torching the chancellor's place was a bit much, but it was the right call if the cat was truly a monster. A lot of people were wondering if Lady Stuart knew about any of this. The chancellor said if the emperor was so jealous of the palace, he would have gladly gifted it to him. It's a shame things ended this way. Julian remarked that was very generous of the chancellor, but he already had his own beautiful home, the imperial palace. He sarcastically added that his palace was way cozier than that gaudy little shack built on the people's taxes. Julian's asking, isn't it a joke from the jump that the emperor's gotta rely on some vassal? He thinks it's totally messed up, and this crap can't keep going on.